Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to do a starter guide for the Retroid Pocket 6. I'm going to walk you through the very beginning all the way to the end to have this fully set up for emulation, PC gaming, and streaming. This handheld is Android based, which means the setup process is going to be almost identical to other similar handhelds, but it's always nice to do an update as well. And along those same lines, you can also use this video to set up other similar Android based handhelds. I just got my orange model in the mail last night, so we're going to set everything up on this guy. This thing is brand new, haven't touched it at all. I love the metallic sheen on this one in particular. I think it really pops. It almost looks golden as opposed to orange or yellow. Let's talk about accessories. Some of these are going to be more important to you than others. First is going to be a micro SD card. Now, depending on the version of the Retroid Pocket 6 you get, it may have 128 or 256 gigs of internal storage. So you could always put your retro games on the internal storage, but if you want to expand that, I would recommend an SD card. It really depends on what type of games you plan on playing. Some of the more advanced systems like PS2 have some pretty big file sizes, and so this kind of card will get eaten up pretty quickly. What I tend to do is I use the internal storage for my Android apps and games, as well as my PC gaming, things like GameHub and Game Native, and then I use my micro SD card for all of my retro game emulation. For the Retroid Pocket 6, I found that the 512 or 256 gigabyte cards has been plenty for me. You can always go to 1 terabyte and beyond, but I feel like that's a little bit overkill. Now, it goes without saying, but ROMs are copyrighted, and so I'm not going to show you in any way how to get all of those game files. You're on your own to acquire them. You can either dump your original cartridges in discs, or you can find them in the more nefarious parts of the internet. To get those games onto a microSD card, you've got a few options. I usually use a microSD card USB reader. This one from Anker is quite old, but it works really well. It's a USB-A connection, and it has a slot for both microSD and regular SD cards. There's also one by Anker as well that has a USB-C and USB port on either side, so this is pretty handy as well. It really depends on how you store your files. I usually keep them all on the computer, and then I'll take one of these and plug it into that computer and then transfer them over to the microSD card. You could always just download the games directly onto your device if you want to do that too. Some other accessories worth considering are a screen protector and an ergonomic grip. I actually made a video showing off these already, so I'll leave that link down below. Another thing I showed off in my review is that Retroid offers their own dock, and it's pretty handy. It allows you to connect it to an external monitor or a TV if you want to consoleize your handheld. And the Retroid Pocket 6 fits nicely with the dock, but any USB-C hub with video out will do. If you go that route, you're probably going to want to use an external controller. I personally like the SN30 Pro just because it kind of looks and feels like a Super Nintendo controller, but still has analog sticks and triggers as well. Another thing to consider is a microfiber cloth. The Retroid Pocket 6 has an all-glass front that gets quite smudgy, so I've been using this one right here from a company called Whoosh, and I've been really enjoying it. I've got a whole written guide on my website that will walk you through the entire setup process, including more in-depth accessory recommendations if you want to check that out. This will also be linked down below. So with that out of the way, let's begin setting up our Retroid Pocket 6. Okay, here we are on the Retroid Pocket 6 screen. I've hooked up a mouse to my device. That way you can see where I'm navigating throughout this guide. And this is going to be a longer video. It takes me a while to go through the entire Android process, and I like to go through it step by step. So I'll have a bunch of chapters down below so you can kind of pick and choose when you want to go through each of these. You don't have to do it all in one sitting. Let's talk about the roadmap we're going to use to set up this device and other Android-based handhelds. First things first, we're going to go into the Android settings and make some configurations that'll make this feel more like a handheld console. From there, we'll jump into the Play Store and add some apps. There are not a lot of things that you actually have to use the Play Store for, other than obviously installing things like Android games or Netflix and so on. From there, we're going to sideload apps. That just means installing them outside of the Google Play Store. It's a very easy process, and the majority of the apps we're going to use can be sideloaded. Once we've got our apps installed, it's then time to add our games and BIOS files. I'll walk you through that too. From there, we're going to go in and configure each of these emulators individually. They'll all be timestamped down below, so you can pick and choose which ones you want to install. This by far will be the longest part of the entire video because we want to get everything just right. Once we've got all that configured, then we're going to set up our front-end launcher so that way we can just go into one single app and navigate through all of our games. And then finally, we're going to enjoy our Retroid Pocket 6. That's really about it. So let's start with the very beginning of setting up Android. Right when you start up the Retroid Pocket 6, it's going to walk you through its welcome screen. First thing, you want to pick your language, then it's going to ask you to connect to the internet, which you can do by opening up your settings. The next page will ask you to set up your time zone, and then after that, it's going to ask you whether or not you want to have Google Play services enabled. I would recommend turning this on. It's going to allow you to use games that require the Google Play Store, and then other apps will also require this too. On the next page, it's going to show you a bunch of pre-installed apps, and they've got a ton here. I never use these. I just install the most recent versions myself, so we'll do that in this video. You've got two different launcher options here. AOSP is just your standard Android. This is what I use, and then I add my own front-end launcher. But if you'd like, you can use the one that they have built in. And that's it for the Retroid configuration, so a pretty easy setup altogether. And so now this is the main Android menu. It's just like any other phone or tablet, but let's go into the settings and make some configuration changes. First thing I like to do is scroll down to the display section, and then there's an option right here that says screen timeout. And you can see that by default, it's 1 minute of activity. That means if you leave your handheld sitting for a minute, it's going to turn the screen off. I like to set it to 30 minutes because I don't like when this happens. While you're in here, you can also turn on the dark theme. Let's go ahead and do that. Further down in the settings, there's a security section, and by default, this one is going to be set with a screen lock of swipe. That means when you first turn on the device from sleep, you have to swipe it to open it up. I don't like having to do that either with my gaming device, so I set it to none. And then finally, one last thing I like to do is go into the notification settings, and then I like to turn on Do Not Disturb. This means I'm not going to get a bunch of sounds and pings from various apps. And it also makes it so that the typing that I do on the keyboard doesn't make any sound either. So it's just a very easy way to make the device a little bit quieter. Now at the very bottom of the Android settings, there's something called handheld settings. Within here, you've got a bunch of different options that you can do that are specific to the Retroid Pocket 6. For example, under Connect TV, you can have it turn off your handheld screen when you actually have it plugged into a TV. And then also you can change which output method you want, maybe 4K 60 or 1080p 60, 120 Hertz. You can set all this up however you would like. If you are going to keep it plugged in a lot, then I would recommend going into the charging settings and charging limit and set it to 80%. That means it's not going to charge the battery up all the way, and that's going to increase the life of your battery over time. Another way to make your battery last longer is to set a lower charge limit. That means it's not going to quick charge as fast, but it's going to make the battery last longer. In the next setting, you can change your vibration strength. I personally like the lowest one, but you can test it and see what you prefer among them. And then finally, the last section I always like to bring up is the input section. So within here, you can map your back keys, and then also you can change out your controller style. So if you want to have it an ABXY that follows the Nintendo pattern, you would set it to retro. I personally like the Xbox pattern, so I'm going to use that one. Same thing with the L2 R2 mode. You can set this to be a digital input if you're going to be playing, say, for example, a Switch game, or you can just set it to be both. That's usually what I do, and that's what it's on by default. One other aspect that falls under Android configuration is if you swipe down from the top, this will be your quick menu. This is where you can adjust things like your performance profile, your fan noise, your refresh rate on your screen, and also those controller inputs that we talked about before. We'll cover this in a more practical sense once we start testing out different emulators and games, but this is where you can find it. There are a bunch of different options within here. So that's all you really need for the Android settings, but now let's talk about the Google Play Store. Technically, you do not need to sign in right here to go through the rest of this emulation guide, but I think that it is worth signing in so that you can update some of the fundamental apps to your device, like Google Chrome and so on. You're also going to need the Play Store for things like Android games and Netflix and NVIDIA GeForce Now, so it is in your best interest to sign in at some point. So now we're going to sideload all of the apps that we need. This used to be a huge pain in the butt, but thanks to a new tool called Obtainium, it's actually pretty easy. So first thing you want to do is open up your Google Chrome browser and search for the letters RJNY. The first result is going to be this Obtainium import file. So we're going to click on that. It's going to take us to this GitHub page. And so this is a pack that will add a bunch of emulators through that Obtainium app. So we can get all of this from this one single page. First thing, scroll down until you get to the point where it says download and install the latest release of Obtainium. Click on that. Once you get to this page, just scroll down until you get to the assets. From there, go down to the very bottom until you find one that says App Release APK. You can click on this and it'll start the download process, and just give it a minute and it'll be done. From there, press the back button on your Retroid Pocket to get back to that previous page, and now under Setup, scroll down until you find this one that says Import Method Latest Release. Next, click on that. It's going to take you to the latest release of the emulation pack, and then from within there, down below, you will see an option under Assets that says Obtainium Emulation Pack. There's also a dual screen option if you've got something like the AYN Thor, but the Retroid Pocket 6 only has one screen, so we're going to pick this one. Once you've got that downloaded, you can double tap the Home button, which will take you back to the home screen, then go into the Files app. Now under download section, you should see two different apps, the APK that we had downloaded previously and the Obtainium emulation pack. Let's start by installing the APK. When you first try to start it up, it's going to say that you don't have permission to install things, so just hit settings here and then turn this on. It's then going to ask you, do you really want to install it? And we're going to hit yeah, man, I want to do it. Once that's done, hit the open button to open up Obtainium, and for here you can set up notifications if you want. I'm going to turn them off. You'll get a welcome screen, just hit OK, and then another one here, hit OK. And now go into Import, Export, Obtainium Import, and then go find that JSON file, the emulation pack. Click on that, and then you'll see something that says Imported 36 Apps and Settings. If we go back into the Apps section, you'll see now there's a bunch of apps that we can install if we would like. Now the Retroid Pocket 6 has a lot of power, so you could install just about anything you would want, but we're going to keep it kind of trimmed to just the major systems. We're also not going to go into the apps that are still a work in progress, so things like PS3 emulation. We're not going to cover that in this particular video just because it is very cutting edge and has a lot of bugs. So scrolling down here alphabetically, we're going to start with Azahar. So this is a Nintendo 3DS emulator and one of my favorites. So we're going to click on this one, and then you'll see an option right down here that says install, so we'll tap on that. For some of these apps like Azahar, there will be multiple options. I tend to go with the Android vanilla version of this particular app, so I'm going to pick that one. After that, it's going to go to the Azahar servers and download the app, and then the first time it's going to ask you to install unknown apps, much like we had earlier, so we're going to turn this one on, then hit back, and then it's going to ask, do you really want to install it? And you know what to do. After that, it'll say installed, and you can see that we have the nice logo here, which means that yes, we're all good to go. Next, we're going to install Cemu. This is a Nintendo Wii U emulator, very easy setup here, so we're just going to hit install. And that's basically it. It's going to go through and download the app itself from the server. It's going to ask if you want to install it, and that's it. Next, we're going to install Dolphin. This is a GameCube and Nintendo Wii emulator. So same process here. We're going to install it. And I think at this point, you probably know exactly how the rest of this is going to go. So let's take a look at the other apps that I recommend installing, at least in this first pass. So I would recommend installing DuckStation. This is a PlayStation 1 emulator. And then also this Nintendo Switch emulator called Eden. One note when it comes to the Eden emulator, I do recommend using the standard version with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 that is found on this device, so that's a pretty easy fix. If you're using something older like the Retroid Pocket 5, then I would recommend using the Legacy version right here. Other apps I recommend installing are MelonDS for Nintendo DS, and then also Nether SX2, which is for PlayStation 2. Going down alphabetically, I also recommend PPSSPP for PlayStation Portable, and then RetroArch is our catch-all for basically all retro systems, everything up through like Dreamcast and Nintendo 64, Sega Saturn. I do all of these within RetroArch. If you're interested in PC emulation, you can get GameHub Lite and Game Native directly through this app. If you want to try out GameHub proper, I would recommend going to the GameHub website and getting the APK there. For the purposes of this video, we're just going to do Game Native right now, so I'm just going to install this one. This file is pretty big, so it's going to take quite some time to actually download. If you plan on using the Retroid Pocket 6 for streaming, there's a streaming section within here, and I recommend using Artemis. This is a lightweight client that is a fork of Moonlight. It works very well. I've got a whole setup guide for Artemis, so I'm not going to do it in this video, but it will be part of that written guide I'll have linked down below. Okay, and so once you've gone through everything within Obtainium, you can see that we've got a bunch of emulator apps already installed. Everything is ready to go. And of note, anytime you want to update these apps in the future, just go through Obtainium. So you'll open this one up, navigate to whatever app you want to update, and then if you scroll down a bit, it'll let you know if there's a new version, and it'll have an update hyperlink right here. Now, the last thing I recommend installing on your device is a frontend. This is going to be a launcher that you can use to navigate through your retro games and then choose them directly within that interface. It makes everything feel like a nice little console. My favorite is Emulation Station Desktop Edition, or ESDE. This is one that I think is a very powerful tool that also organizes your ROM folders for you and then just makes it feel very console-like. Among all the other frontends, this one has the most themes and the most robust support overall, and so this is why it's my favorite. However, one thing to keep in mind, this is a paid app for Android. In fact, this is the only thing throughout this entire guide that's going to cost you any money, and it's $5.50 as a one-time purchase. Now, the way this works is a little bit wonky, but you have to go onto Patreon and subscribe to their membership, but only for 1 month. It's going to charge you $5.50 up front, and after that you can turn off the recurring billing, so that way it's not going to charge you again. And at that point you'll have access to this and all future updates. They'll send you an email every time they have a new release, and then you can just download it directly from there. It's a little bit weird, and it's mostly because this app can't go on the Google Play Store because of permissions issues, so you kind of have to do a little bit of workaround to get this via Patreon, but after that it's going to be smooth sailing. Of note, if you don't plan on using Emulation Station in the very beginning, for example, maybe you're going to buy this one later, you want to try a different front end, I've made a tool that's going to help you out. It's called ESDE Directories. It's a very simple setup, but essentially this will include the ROMs folder that ESDE makes when you first install it. This is going to allow you to have a bunch of subfolders with lists of all the different systems, and then you can drop all your ROMs inside of there. This is great because the other front ends don't really care what folders you use, but ESDE does. So if you ever go back to ESDE in the future, this will all be pre-configured for you. So you've got two paths right here, and it really depends on what you plan on doing. If you plan on using Emulation Station, then obviously just sign up for their Patreon, get added to the list, and then download the APK. If you don't want to buy that app, then I would recommend downloading this release that I'll also have linked down below. It's just this one ROM zip folder, and then you'll just drag and drop this unzipped into your microSD card. It's also worth noting that Emulation Station Desktop Edition is not the only front end out there. There are many different options. Some of my favorite include Beacon and Daigisho, Console Launcher, and Reset Collection. And of note, Daigisho is free. So you do have a bunch of options here, and I'm not trying to pigeonhole you into only using one, but I found it is the easiest way to get a device set up, and so that's why I recommend Emulation Station Desktop Edition. So back on the device, I've already downloaded the ESDE app, as you can see it right here, so I'm just going to install this. This is the first thing that we need to do before we start adding our games and ROMs, because this will build out that file directory that we were talking about before. So I'm going to click on this one here. It's going to ask, do I want to install it? And I'm going to say yes. And so now you can see the app right here. One of the things I like to do with this one is move it over to the front page, so it's very easy to access, because often I'll just turn on the device and then start this right up. You can also make this your home launcher, so the moment you start up the device, it just goes directly into that. I'll show you how to do that near the end of the video. Now, before you launch ESDE for the first time, you need to put in your microSD card first, because we're going to build out a ROMs folder on that card, so it needs to be inserted. Now, once we open up the app, the first thing it's going to ask is to begin the setup process, and it'll ask you to change the permissions and allow it to manage your storage, so go ahead and do that. Now, the next thing it's going to ask is to select your ESDE directory. This is the directory that's going to include all of the app data, so things like your scraped box art and your games list and other settings like that. So we're going to put this one on the microSD card as well. You can put it on the internal storage, but I like putting it on the card because that means if I use this card in a different device, I'll still have all my scraped box art. So within here under select directory, by default, it's going to try to put it on the internal storage, as you can see here. We want to put it on the microSD card, so I'm going to select that. Now, this card that I'm using here today has already been used with a Retroid Pocket device before, and so it already has this folder. Same thing with the ROMs folder we'll do in a moment. But the way you would create this folder is you would just hit create new folder, and then make sure that it's the exact same name here, ESDE with a dash in between and all caps. Once you've created that folder, you can then go inside of it. You can see I've got all these subfolders because I've been using it before, but yours will be blank. And then just select use this folder. It's going to ask to give you permissions, just hit allow. And then next it's going to ask you to do the same thing, but with the ROMs directory. So same thing here, but make sure that it's 3 caps and then lowercase s. So this time we're going to go to select directory. Again, it's going to try to put it in the default like internal storage, but we want to go to the microSD card. So we're going to hit disk. And then same thing here. I've already created a folder, but you would want to hit create new folder and then make sure it's capital ROM lowercase s. Once you've created the folder, you can go inside and you won't have any subfolders, but I already do because I've used it before, and then just select use this folder and then allow. And this next section, it's going to ask you to create system directories, and this is where it's going to put all those subfolders inside of your ROMs folder. It's all going to be up to you. Even though I already have created all of those folders, I usually select create them. It's not going to overwrite anything, but if maybe I'm using a newer version of ESDE and it's got like an additional system that it now supports, I want to make sure it creates that folder too. So I'm going to hit create them. Once that's done, it's going to say setup complete. You can hit I understand. And usually right here, it's not going to show anything. It'll create your system directories and then say that you don't have any games loaded just yet. For my device, I already have a bunch of ROMs installed, so it's going to show that. We're not even going to mess with ESDE at all just yet. We just wanted to have those folders created. So even though your screen is going to look different than this, just press the start button, then go down to quit ESDE, and then yes for really quit. Now, once we've installed those Emulation Station Desktop Edition folders, one last thing we need to do is add this custom system files folder. So this is going to allow us to add additional emulators later on in the system. It's a very quick process, but one thing that is necessary if you want to play certain systems like 3DS and Nintendo Switch. I'll have links to this in the written guide down below, or you can also just search for ESDE Android custom systems within your Chrome browser and then make sure the developer is Glazed Belmont. Once you're on this page, then you should be good to go. available. Once you're here, just go down and scroll over to the right. You'll see this releases section. Just click on the latest release. And then as you scroll down, you'll see 2 XML files. This is what we need to download. So just download these each individually. They are very small files. It should only take a second. Once they are downloaded, we can exit out of Google Chrome and then go into the Files app. And then you should see them right here within your Downloads folder. Now just long press on each of these one by one, and then go up to the top right, and then select the Move To option right here. Now what we want to do is move them into our ESDE folder on the microSD card. So we're going to go over on the left side here, pick our microSD card, pick ESDE, and then find the Custom Systems folder that was created when we first installed this. Once you have this all set up, hit Move, and then give it a second. It'll move these 2 files over. So at this point, we've installed our emulators, we've installed a front end, and it's also created all those subdirectories. You can either do that manually through that tool that I made on GitHub, or you can do it through the ESDE app. And so the next step is to add all of our games and BIOS files. You've got multiple ways you can do this. What I'm going to do is eject my microSD card and then put it into my computer and then transfer everything over there. There are other ways you could do that. You could, for example, plug an external hard drive into your Retroid Pocket and then transfer them over directly on the device, or you could just download the ROMs directly onto the device as well. We're going to do it over PC just to make it a little bit easier to see. Okay, so here we are on the computer. I've got my microSD card plugged in. You can see all of the directories here. We're going to go into the ROMs folder. This is where we're going to add all of our games. Now, how you add them is all going to be up to you. Like I mentioned before, ROMs are copyrighted, so you're on your own to find them, but I'm going to assume that you have your own library, and you just need to add your games to their respective folder. So as an example, let's say you've got Game Boy games. You're going to want to go down to the GB folder, which is where the Game Boy games are, and then add all of your files. You can see I've already added them here in a previous setup. And so that essentially is how you're going to add all of your games. And most of these folder names make intuitive sense. GB for Game Boy Advance, Game Boy Color, and so on. If you have arcade games from the MAME ROM sets, you would want to put them in the MAME folder, and then just so on and so forth. Nintendo 3DS, Nintendo 64. One thing that always trips me up with ESDE is that they have a specific folder for North American Super Nintendo games. It's SNES NA. So by default, this is going to be the European ones under SNES, and then you would put the North American ROMs within here. I'm located in the United States, so I like to put mine in here. In the end, this is probably one of the shortest sections of the video, but it really is probably going to take up most of your time just because you're going to have to find all those ROMs, organize them in a way that makes sense for you, and then add them to these folders. On my website, I've got other guides that will help you as well, including a ROM file compression guide. So if you're going to be using any disk-based system, Nintendo GameCube, PS2, and so on, you can actually compress these files to make them a smaller file size, which is going to allow you to put more games on your microSD card. So this will all be part of that written guide that I will have linked down below. Now, if you've ever got a question about which file types you can use with each system, then this has actually already been taken care of for you by ESDE. If you go into any of these folders, like say, for example, the NES folder, I've already got my games in here, obviously, but there's going to be a file called systeminfo.txt within each of these folders. If you open it up, it's actually going to tell you specifically which file types are supported. So you can find that right here. In this case, you can see that .NES files are accepted. That's what I typically will use. But if you have the files zipped, you can also use those too. And so in the case of NES, you can see that all my file types are .NES files, which corresponds to what is available within the system info file. Now, in addition to the game files themselves, there are some systems that require BIOS files. These are system level files required to make some of these systems work properly. Here's a list of all the most common BIOS files. If you don't see your favorite system listed here, chances are it doesn't need BIOS files at all. And it should be noted that much like with game files, BIOS files are copyrighted, so I can't share where to find them, but you're going to be on your own to Google it. For some systems like Game Boy and Game Boy Color, they're actually optional, so if you add these 2 BIOS files, it just means that you will see the boot logo when you start up the game, but that's it. It's not going to be necessary to actually play those games. Meanwhile, for Game Boy Advance, depending on the emulator that you use, you will need to have those BIOS files. For Nintendo Switch, you need a prod.keys file as well as a firmware zip file, and they need to match between the file version for each of them. I recommend using 19.0.1. For PS1 and PS2, there are multiple different BIOS files depending on the system that you pull them from. There were many different versions of each of those platforms. So these 2 that are listed right here are just examples, but there are other options that you could use. Neo Geo is a little bit wonky. This one needs to be added to the ROM folder, like the Neo Geo folder, as opposed to the BIOS folder. I just put them in both. And finally, the other one that's a little bit weird is Dreamcast. So this one needs to be put in its own folder labeled DC_. So you'll make that folder, then put those 2 files inside of that within your BIOS folder. So now that we understand what the BIOS files are and you have a list of the ones that you should be looking for, let's put them on our disk as well. It doesn't really matter where you put the BIOS files, so what I often will do is just put them directly in the ROMs folder. So I'm going to right click here, go to New, and then Folder, and I'm going to make a folder and I'm going to name it BIOS. So now within this folder, I can put all my BIOS files, which I happen to have right here on my desktop. So once more, let me explain each of these as I go through. Here is the Dreamcast folder. Here you can see I've got those 2 files inside of it, so I'm going to move that one over. These next 3 are for Sega CD. If you're just going to be playing Genesis or 32X, you don't need them, so it's only for that one system. Next, I have my Nintendo Switch files, so that's the prod keys as well as the firmware file. I like to make sure that these are matching. 19.0.1 is the one that I use. It's recommended by the Eden team, so these are both there. I'm just going to move them over. Next are the 3 Game Boy BIOS files. Like I mentioned, Game Boy Advance may be necessary depending on the emulator that you use, but in general, these are optional. Next, we've got the Sega Saturn BIOS files, and these are going to be required to run the Beetle Saturn core that we're going to be using in this video. Like I mentioned before, the Neo Geo one needs to be put in the Neo Geo folder, but I often will put this in the BIOS folder as well, just to be safe. And then finally, we've got our 2 PlayStation BIOS files, the PS1 and the PS2 versions. You can tell the difference between the two because the PS2 version is usually about 4 megabytes. And like I said, the number version here doesn't really matter at all. Just make sure that you get something that works. So that's it when it comes to adding your games and BIOS files. I know this BIOS step can be a little bit confusing, but hopefully I made it as clear as possible without actually giving you the files themselves. So at this point, we have added all of our games and BIOS files. We're ready to start configuring our emulators one by one. So I'm going to eject this microSD card and put it back into my Retroid Pocket 6. So back on our device here, let's go over to our emulator apps. We're going to start with the lowest powered systems, then work our way up. So we're going to start with the RetroArch. This is the big one. This one is going to work with all your retro systems all the way up to Dreamcast, Nintendo 64, and Sega Saturn. We're going to spend the most time on this app in particular because configuring it can be a bit of a nightmare. I've also got a dedicated RetroArch starter guide that will walk you through some of the deeper components of this app. In this video, we're just going to do the surface level stuff and get it up and running. So first thing you want to do once you open it up is it's going to ask you to grant access to external storage. We're going to hit OK. You'll get another prompt and go ahead and allow that. And then it's going to configure the app for the very first time. You'll know it's ready once you have this better looking font. Once we're in RetroArch, the first thing I always recommend doing is go down to the online updater and let's go into the core downloader. This is going to be where we download our emulation cores or emulators. By default, RetroArch is not going to have any of this stuff installed, so you have to install it all one by one based on the systems you plan on playing. When it comes to arcade games, I often will use Final Burn Neo ROM sets, so I'm going to download that one. And then same thing with MAME, I like to use the MAME 2003 Plus ROM set, so I'm going to download that core as well. These are some of the largest cores, they take a little bit longer to download. After that, I go down to the Nintendo section, and Game Boy and Game Boy Color, I like to use the Gambate core, so I'm going to download that one. And then for Game Boy Advance, I like to use the MGBA core. And even though there are cores for other systems like GameCube and Wii, we're not going to use these in RetroArch. We're going to use these standalone emulators. Those perform a little bit better. So next will be NES. I like to use the Nestopia core, so I'm going to download that one. And then when it comes to Nintendo 64, you've got 3 different options. I actually download all 3, so I just go through here and grab each of them. For Super Nintendo, I just use the standard SNES 9X core, but if you want to use something that's a little bit more accurate and more demanding, you've got the processing power for it with the Retroid Pocket 6, so you could use the BSNES core instead. Moving now to the Sega systems, I like to use the Flycast core. This is for Dreamcast and Sega Naomi. And then for Sega Genesis, I like to use Genesis Plus GX. This will also work with Sega CD. You've got a few options when it comes to Sega Saturn. I prefer the Beetle Saturn core. It's the most accurate one and it is more demanding, but we have the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 in the Retroid Pocket 6, so this is going to work no problem. And then finally, under PlayStation, you've got 4 different optional cores. We're going to use the standalone DuckStation emulator in this particular video, but if you want to keep it within RetroArch, you can do that too, and then choose one of these. Other than that, there are definitely more obscure systems you can install and play on here as well, but we're just going to stick with the popular stuff, so that's about it. Once we're done with this section, we can press the back button to get back to the online updater section, and now what I like to do is scroll down to the bottom once it starts to say to update, and so I go through each of these and I update them one by one. Of note, the cheats one takes the longest to actually download and extract, so be prepared to wait about 5 minutes once you do that, but if you want to use cheats, this is an easy way to do it. Once you get to the bottom, it's going to say update GLSL shaders. These are OpenGL shaders, and this is going to be necessary for certain cores, for example with Nintendo 64, so I do recommend updating these shaders. But once you have it updated, we're actually going to switch the video output mode to Vulkan, because that works a lot better, and it has a different shader set. So that's the next thing we're going to do. We're going to press the back button to get to the main menu, and then press right twice to get to the settings menu. Now go into video and then output, and then change the video here from GL to Vulkan. Once you've made that change, press the back button 3 times to get to the settings menu, then press left twice to get to the main menu again, then scroll down to the very bottom and quit RetroArch. You've got to do that in order to reset the video backend, so that way when we open it up again, now it'll be using the Vulkan backend. And now we want to go back to Online Updater and go all the way down to the bottom, and you can see that now says Update Slang Shaders. These are the Vulkan backend shaders that are more robust, and these are the ones I recommend, so we're going to download these ones. Once you've got those downloaded and extracted, we are ready to actually get into the meat and potatoes of RetroArch and its configuration. This can be a little bit confusing, so the first thing I like to do is change what they call the menu driver. This is going to be the theme of RetroArch. It just makes it a little bit easier to navigate through when doing a guide. So I'm going to press right twice to get back to the settings menu, then I'm going to scroll down until I find drivers. Once I get into drivers, I'm going to go into menu driver. We've got 4 different themes to choose from. I prefer XMB when showing off guides. This is the Sony PlayStation cross media bar, like how it looked on the PSP and the PS3. Now that we've changed it, you can see it says restart required. So we're going to hit back, go back to the main menu, and then quit it, and then open up RetroArch again. This time when we open it up, you can see it kind of looks like a PlayStation 3, and this is more intuitive to me. We can go and navigate through each of the different menus, and then there are sub-menus that we can navigate through up and down. And so now that we're here, we're going to go into the settings menu and adjust some of these settings to make it work with Emulation Station and everything else. First thing I like to do under user interface, I like to go into on-screen notifications, notification visibility, and then turn on the frame rate. You can see it shows at the top right, so that way I know if a game is playing at 60 frames per second. If you don't care about that, then go ahead and leave this off. That's all we have to do in this section, so we can back out here till we get to the on-screen notifications section. You can go up to appearance if you would like and change some of these options. For example, if you want a different color, you can change that here. You can also make the text larger or smaller depending on how good your eyesight is. So all this is going to be up to you. Let's go ahead and go back into the settings section again. Now let's go down into the input section. This is one of the most important sections to get right. So the first thing once you go into input is the RetroPad bind section. This is going to show all of the different controls that you can configure. Now by default, the Retroid Pocket 6 should work just fine. So you probably don't need to set any of these by default. It should just work out of the gate. But if you run into any problems, for example, the select button isn't showing up or something, you can go in here and actually assign it per button. I don't think it's really necessary, so we're not going to do that here. Let's go back to this main input menu. Next, we're going to set up hotkeys. These are probably the most important thing you can do in RetroArch. These are going to be a combination of keys that you will press to do different functions without having to go into the menu itself. Here's a layout of all of the hotkeys that I like to set up with the Retroid Pocket 6. The most important button is your hotkey enable button, which you can see here is assigned to select with my setup. What this means is I press the hotkey enable button first, and then any of the other buttons that are also labeled, and that's going to perform that function. So for example, to quit out of RetroArch, I'm going to press select and start. Along those same lines, if I want to save a state, I'm going to press select an R1 or select an R2 to toggle fast forward. So let's go through the hotkeys menu and actually set all of these up. We'll go into hotkey enable. This is going to be that select button like I mentioned before. You just have to press and hold it until it shows it up here. From there, I like to scroll down to the menu toggle. This one I assign to the top button of your ABXY pattern, which is the X button on the Retroid Pocket 6. So I'm going to press and hold that one. This means at any time I can press select and X to bring up the quick menu if I need to make any sort of adjustments like toggling on or off a shader. For the next one is the quit section. We actually want to quit RetroArch every time we close out of a game because that's going to take us right back to Emulation Station and it's going to make sure that it saves and everything else. So for this one, I assign it to the start button like I showed in the diagram. Next is fast forward toggle. I like to use this with R2. So I'm going to set that up right here. Two other buttons that are very important for me are loading and saving a state. For load state, I like to do L1. And then for saving a state, I do R1. That means I can press select in either of these buttons to save a state or load it right then and there. Another one that's important to me is run ahead. This allows you to reduce input latency as you're playing a game, which is really important for some retro games. So I set this to the right D-pad. This means I can press select and right at any time, and that will toggle on run ahead if I want it. Another thing I like to do is select in Y, which is the leftmost ABXY button, to toggle on the frames per second on the top right in case I don't want to see them. There are a ton of other hotkeys that we can set up, but those are the most rudimentary ones that I always recommend for the very beginning. So that's it for me. I'm good right here. Now I'm going to back out to the main input menu, and the last thing I like to do in this section is under Confirm, Quit, Close, Reset, I like to turn this one off. That means that I only have to press select and start one time to close out of the game. If you want to have to press it twice to make sure that you don't accidentally close out of the game, you can do that too. So it really just depends on how you like to play. For me personally, I live a little bit on the edge, so I turn this one off, so I only press select and start one time to close out of the game. Okay, so back in the menu here, the next thing I like to look at is the saving section. So within here, there's only two sections that I actually change, and that's the autosave and auto load. This means that when you close out of that game, it's going to make an autosave state. And then when you start up the game again, it's going to auto load that save state. So it's kind of like a quick resume if you want to jump right back into your game. It's obviously a matter of taste and whether or not you want to have that automatically, but I personally like that. Let's go ahead and back out. And then the next section that we want to go into is the achievement section. So they have something called retro achievements. It works like your Xbox like achievements or your PlayStation trophies, the same kind of idea, but for retro games. To set this up, you want to go to retroachievements.org and then make a free username and password. And once you have that set up, you want to turn this one on, add your username and password right here. And then one other thing I recommend is turning off hardcore mode, because by default it's going to be on, but this is going to prevent you from using save states. And I would rather use those save states, so I play without hardcore mode. So if you want to check this out, I would recommend signing up for that username and password and then adding it here. The last thing we want to do is go into the directory section, and within here we want to point it to our BIOS folder. It's really important to make sure that some of these games work properly. We're going to click on this. It's going to show us a specific folder, but we want to back out to get to the microSD card. So we're going to hit the parent directory several times until we get to the point where it shows this string of numbers and letters. That's actually our microSD card. So we're going to select that one, and then you'll see your microSD card directory. And if you remember, under the ROMs folder, we made that BIOS folder. So I'm just going to go and navigate to that. And then once I'm there, I'm going to open it up and then select use this directory. And that's it. And so this is all we need to do to configure RetroArch that very first time. There are a couple other things we need to do once we start playing some games, which we'll do next. So at this point, I like to back out to the main menu, then go down to Configuration File, Save Current Configuration, just to make sure everything is properly saved, and then I'm going to quit. At this point, if you're just looking to play retro games, most of them have already been configured for you, which is pretty awesome. So at this point, let's go into Emulation Station Desktop Edition and actually see how everything is going to look. Once it opens up, it's probably going to look like this, and we will properly configure ESDE later, but before that, I want to set up the emulators themselves. In the meantime, there are a couple things we can do to make this a little bit easier to navigate. So for example, you see these touchscreen controls that we don't really need because we have controls on the device. So I'm going to press start here, go into Input Device Settings, and then under Enable Touch Overlay, I'm going to turn this one off. It's going to give me a warning, but that's fine. We've got controls on the device itself. So now if I touch the screen, we're not going to see those controls anymore. And the way that this works is any game that you've added to any of those folders when we are putting them on the microSD card, you will now see them here listed within the directory. When you go into these directories, by default, it's not going to show any box art like you can see here, but because I've already used this card before, I've already scraped my box art previously, it is looking very nice and fancy. I'll show you how to do this later in the video, but right now it's not going to show this way for you. My main point here is to show you that this is how you start up a game. So you're going to find your system, find your game, and then you'll launch it from here. Before that, the next thing we need to do is make sure that when ESDE launches a specific game, it knows which emulator to start up. So let's do that first. We're going to press the start button. We're going to go down to Other Settings and then Alternative Emulators. So based on the apps we've installed, as well as the RetroArch emulator cores that we've already downloaded, I'm going to show you which ones to select. So under Dreamcast, we just want to use the default Flycast. That's going to be the RetroArch core. Same thing with Game Boy Advance, I recommend the MGBA. That's the one we downloaded. Same thing with Gambate with Game Boy Color. When it comes to GameCube, by default, it's going to have the Dolphin core within RetroArch, but we want the Dolphin standalone emulator, so I'm going to select that one. For Sega Genesis, I prefer the default RetroArch core, so that one's good. And then under MAME, I do prefer the 2003 Plus one. That's the ROM set I use, so I'm going to select that. Once we get to 3DS, you should have a bunch of options right here, and I prefer to use the standalone Azahar one, so I'm going to use that. For Nintendo 64, the default is Mupen 64 Plus, so we're going to leave it like that. That's going to work within RetroArch. And then for Nintendo DS, I like to use the standalone MelonDS emulator, so that's my choice. If you have Neo Geo, then the Final Burn Neo core is usually what you will use there. And then for NES, I prefer the Nestopia core, but honestly, any of these work, so depending on whatever you downloaded, just pick that one. I used Nestopia, so that's the one I'm choosing. Under PS2, it's a little bit weird. It says Aether SX2, but that's actually Neither SX2 is also supported, so we're just going to use that one. That's going to work just fine with PS2. For PSP, I recommend the standalone emulator, so that's what we're going to use there. And then under PlayStation, you've got a bunch of different options here. We're using the standalone DuckStation emulator this time around, so I'm going to pick that. Under Saturn, the default is Beetle Saturn Core. That's one we're going to use, so all good. Same thing with Super Nintendo. We're using just SNES 9X, but you could change that to BSNES or something else if you would like. Under Nintendo Switch, I prefer the Eden emulator. That's the one we downloaded, so we're going to pick that one. And then under Nintendo Wii, like with GameCube, we're going to use the standalone Dolphin. And then finally, under Wii U, the default is the Cemu standalone emulator, so all that is good to go. And so now that we've actually configured each of these, that means that when we try to start up a game, it should work with the correct emulator. At this point, we've only configured RetroArch so far, so let's stick with that for now, and then we'll work on the other emulators next. Let's start with Game Boy. There's a couple things that I like to do here when I first start up a game. Let's start up Castlevania Adventure. A couple things are going to happen when you first start it up. You'll see the Nintendo boot logo. If you've added your BIOS, you can also see that it shows our achievements at the very top. Another thing you may notice is it has touchscreen controls on the screen itself, and the game is running in black and white. So let's change all that stuff. We need to get into the quick menu. We're going to press Select and X to open that up. Once you're in here, the first thing I like to do is on-screen overlay and then turn this one off. That's going to remove all those touchscreen controls. We don't have to see that one again. Next, I like to go up to core options. This is where we're going to make it so it's not black and white. So Game Boy colorization, we're going to set this to internal. Under internal palette, we're going to go down to the bottom here and pick TWB64 Pack 1. Once you have that set up, we can go into the Pack 1 palette, and my favorite is number 28, which is the game.com version. So navigate to that. And really, that's all you can do. There are some other things if you'd like. For example, you can set up interframe blending, which will give an LCD ghosting effect, but we're not going to get into the weeds with this one. We're just going to go back into the game itself by pressing the back button, get back to quick menu, and then resume. So now we don't have the touchscreen controls, and now the game is showing this nice kind of green color to it, which looks very good and kind of reminds me a bit of the original Game Boy. One other thing we can do while we're in here is add an LCD grid shader to make this look a little bit more authentic. So I'm going to go back into the quick menu by pressing Select and X. I'm going to go down to the bottom now under shaders. I'm going to turn on video shaders and go into load preset. Most of the emulator cores are going to use the slang shaders. We're going to go into that, and then we'll go into handheld. And then within that, go down until you find the LCD 3X shader. Once you select that, it's going to automatically configure it and set it up for you. So now all you have to do is just go back into the game and see if you like it. So we're going to press back a couple times, get back to quick menu, then resume. And so now you can see we have an LCD grid effect on the top of our screen. I think it looks great. If you're happy with that, we're going to go and save it. So this shows up every time. So we're going to press Select and X again, then go into shaders. We're going to go into manage presets and then go down to save core preset. So this means that any game that we play under the Gambate core, which includes Game Boy and Game Boy Color, it's going to use this LCD 3X shader. If you want, you can change it up a little bit. For example, if you want to save it by content directory preset, that means that only things in the Game Boy folder are going to have this shader. The core one works better with this particular setup because Game Boy and Game Boy Color use that same core, and so I don't have to do it twice. You could do other things like save it as a game preset, so if you only had this one game and you want to have this shader on it, then you could use that as well. Either way, we're going to do save core preset, and once you press it, that's fine. You can always remove it if you don't want it either. So now at this point, we have it all set up, so I'm going to exit out of here, go back to quick menu and resume. And now let's play around a little bit with some of the other settings that we have within RetroArch. So here we are in the game. Let's start with playing with save states. So if I press select in R1, it's going to save a state. Now, if I move the character a little bit and progress further in the game and I decide I want to go back to where I was, I can press select in L1. It's going to load that state. So that's the way you can do a quick save. Another thing we can do is turn off the frames per second by pressing select and Y. You can see it goes away or comes back. And then also I can press select and right on the D-pad. That'll turn on run ahead. So now it's going to run a little bit more zippier than normal. It'll be a bit more demanding on the CPU, but this CPU can handle just about anything in RetroArch, so it probably isn't going to be an issue at all. So at this point, I'm happy with how Game Boy is set up. I'm going to press select and start to exit out of this game. It's going to save where I was. So for example, when I start up this game again, you will see that it will auto load exactly where we were before. So this is super handy for me. Now let's test it out and see that it works with Game Boy Boy Color too. So let's go over here. Let's just start up a random game. Let's do Bust-A-Move 4. And sure enough, you can see it's got the LCD grid shader already applied to it. So everything is good here when it comes to Game Boy Color as well. This is also the shader I recommend for Game Boy Advance, so I would recommend going through that process with that one as well. Let's try Super Nintendo and talk about CRT shaders, which are an important component of playing with an OLED display, like here on the Retroid Pocket 6. So let's start up a game. And by default, this is what the game's going to look like, kind of pixelated. This is just how emulation works. But say we want it to look a little bit more old school with a CRT effect. We're going to go into the quick menu by selecting X. Then we're going to go into the shaders again, and now under Load Preset, we're going to go back to Slang and then CRT. There are a ton of options within here, and each of these are going to do a different thing, so it's always worth experimenting. One of my favorites is CRT Geom Deluxe. It's a bit more of a heavy-duty shader, but I think it looks great, and the chipset on this device can handle it no problem. So let's select that one. Once we have it selected, we can back out to the quick menu here and then resume the game. And so this is what the game looks like now. We've got these nice scan lines, and everything just looks a little bit more balanced and a little bit deeper. If you don't like the shader, you can obviously go in and load a different one, but I like this one. So I'm going to save this one specifically for Super Nintendo games. So I'm going to go back into the quick menu, go into shaders, and then under Manage Preset, I'm going to save it as a core preset. That means anytime I start up a Super Nintendo game with this particular core, it's going to have this CRT effect. Once you've got it saved, that's basically all you have to do. So let's go ahead and quit out of the game now, and then go and pick up another one. So let's say F-Zero. And as soon as I start it up, you can see that, yeah, it's got the CRT effect already applied. So I'm happy with that. You can do that with any of the other 16-bit cores, Nintendo, Genesis, arcade games. All this is going to be a lot of fun. One thing worth noting, when you start up a game within the Retroid Pocket 6, you're going to see a little white line on the right side, and this is basically their quick menu. And if we slide your finger across, you can see that it brings up all this information. There's some pretty cool stuff within here. You can monitor your CPU temperature and everything else, but for the most part, you may not want to actually access that. So let's talk about how to get rid of that. So you just want to swipe down from the top to bring up this top menu. There's a bunch of things within here that'll be important with certain systems and maybe not with some other ones. So for example, here under the performance section, you can change out your different performance profiles. When playing a retro game, you can use the standard profile, no problem. But when playing something really intensive, like a heavy-duty Switch game or a PC game, then you may want to put it in high performance mode. Along those same lines, you may want to adjust the fan settings, which you can tap here, and it'll adjust each of these based on your performance profile. For the most part, I like to use the smart option. That means it'll ramp up when it's needed, but obviously you do you. This is also the menu where you can adjust things like your LED lights on your device. So you can tap on this and change the color and the brightness and saturation. You can also change out your controller style in L2 and R2 mode, which we already did previously in the Android settings. But getting back to that white bar on the right side, if you don't want to see it, then just scroll over here till you find that floating icon, then tap that, it'll go away. If you ever need to bring it back, you can tap it again. So very easy to get rid of that if you don't like it. While we're in here, let's talk about the 60 to 120 Hertz options that we have on this device. We can change the screen refresh rate right here on the fly. This is important because at 120 Hertz, you can do extra things within RetroArch, and that's what we're configuring right now. So let's set this to 120 Hertz and then talk about it once we go back into the app. By virtue of having a 120 Hz display like this, that means that we can use special options like black frame insertion and CRT beam simulator shader. These are shaders that will essentially improve the motion clarity of your games as you're playing it with some of these retro titles. When you combine this with the CRT shader, it gives it a very CRT-like effect. It's not going to be the same as playing on an old school TV, but it's a lot closer than playing just on a random LCD. I've got a whole video talking about that setup process, so we're not going to go into details with this video. I don't want to make this thing 3 hours long. But I will show you the quick basics. So let's go back into the quick menu here. And now you want to press the back button to get back into the settings menu, and then go under video and then synchronization. And what you want to do is under shader subframes, turn this one on to 2. Once you've got this turned on, let's go back into the quick menu again. And this time we're going to go back into shaders. And once we're in this menu, we're going to go into prepend preset. This means that in addition to the CRT shader we've already applied, we're going to add something underneath it. That's going to be the sub shader BFI. So we're going to go into here, and then under shaders slang, we're going to go down to subframe BFI near the bottom, and then find the one that says CRT beam simulator. We're going to turn that one on. And then the last thing we have to do is under shader parameters, you want to go down into the LCD anti-retention, turn this one from 1 to 0 by pressing left, and then also do the same thing under scan direction, set this one to 0. This is just a very simple way of setting up CRT beam simulator with the CRT effect added as well. So once we have these both set up, we can go back and then go into quick menu menu, resume, and then usually at this point it'll look really good on your screen. Now my screen capture card is not having a good time with this, so it keeps flickering back and forth, but you're just gonna have to trust that it does work really well. I would recommend checking out that guide that I had mentioned before, which is also going to be linked down below as part of that Retroid Pocket starter guide. Either way, if you do like the way it looks, let's talk about how to save that. So we're going to press select next to get back into the quick menu again. We're going to go into shaders, and then now under manage presets, we're just going to do save core preset again. This is going to overwrite that core preset we had already used for that other CRT shader, but this time with adding that CRT beam simulator shader. So that's what I would recommend for your older systems, 16-bit, 8-bit arcade systems. If you want to have that BFI as well as a nice CRT shader, that's the process for setting that up. Let's talk about some of the higher end systems that you can also play on RetroArch. Let's do Dreamcast next. So what you can do here is start up a game. And by default, this emulation core is going to run at 480p. It looks very chunky. You may want something like this, or you may want to have it upscaled. You got a couple different options. The first would be to add a CRT effect to it. So if you wanted to play it very old school, you could just leave it at a 480p resolution like this, and then add one of those CRT shaders. So just like what we did with Super Nintendo, but you can do that here with Dreamcast. So load preset, shader slang, CRT, and let's do the CRT Geom Deluxe one again. So we're going to select that one, and now go back into the game. And now it doesn't look quite as chunky. It looks a little bit old school, right? Like with a CRT TV. So if you wanted to relive those days of the late 90s playing this on an old CRT television, there you are. But let's say maybe you don't want that. You want to have something a bit more upscaled and modern. So I'm going to go back into the shader section here, and then under shader passes, I'm going to set this to 0 and then apply changes. That means it's going to remove the shader. You can see it got a little bit chunkier in the background. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up here to the core options, and I'm going to increase the resolution scaling. So we can do that under video, and then you can see internal resolution by default is set to 480p. We're going to change this to 2.25. That's going to be 1080p. Many of these games also support widescreen cheats, so we're going to add that as well if you want to play this in 16:9 instead of 4:3. So we're going to go down to emulation hacks, then widescreen cheats, turn that one on. That's all you really have to do for Dreamcast. So the other thing you have to do is just restart the game. So what I usually will do is I'll start up the game again, and then I'm going to press select and start to exit out of it, and then I'll restart it again. I'm not sure if this one has widescreen cheats in particular, but as you can see, sure enough, it does. And so now we're playing this game at 1080p, so it looks a little bit more upscaled, and it's also widescreen, so it's filling out the entire display. So again, you got a couple different options depending on what you want to actually do. You could always do different combinations. You could turn on widescreen cheats, but then keep it at 480p and then add a CRT shader to have a very unique look. Let's talk about Nintendo 64. This one is also very similar to Dreamcast in its setup, but with one additional caveat. Let's go in here and start up a game. Let's just do Banjo-Kazooie. We can do a lot of these same similar settings. So if we press select next to get into the quick menu, we can go into core options here and say, for example, under glide N64, we can adjust the 4:3 resolution. So if we want to upscale this to 1080p, we can do that right here. Along those same lines, you could also set up a CRT shader just like we did with Dreamcast. The one very important thing about Nintendo 64 and Emulation Station is you have to make one control configuration to make sure it works properly. So what you want to do here is hit back a few times to get back into this main settings, go into input, and then within here, you'll see near the bottom that it says polling behavior late. What we want to do is actually set this to early. If you leave it at late, sometimes when you start up a Nintendo 64 game through Emulation Station, it's not going to actually pick up on your controls, and it can be really frustrating. Once you have that set up, we need to save this. So we're going to go back into the quick menu and now go to the override section. This allows us to save a specific configuration for Nintendo 64. So what we want to do here is save core override. This will save that polling behavior bug, and we should be good to go after that. Same thing here, you want to restart the game so that you can see it in 1080p. So let's start up Banjo-Kazooie again, and this time it'll be in a much higher resolution. And so there you go, now you can see the sprites are a lot more high definition. Now, one thing you can do with some Nintendo 64 games is play them in widescreen. They're not going to be as well supported as it is in Dreamcast. You kind of have to play it one game at a time, but let me show you how that works too. For this example, we're going to use Super Mario 64. So you can see this game is playing in 4:3. You've got the black bars on the left and right, but Mario's face is running at 1080p because we did turn on that upscaling. This game does have excellent widescreen support, so let me show you how to set that up. We're going to press select and X to get into the quick menu, go back into core options. This time under glide N64, what we want to do under wide resolution, set this one to 1080p. Once you have that set up, go into aspect ratio. You've got a couple options here. What we want to do is the wide adjusted one. This means that if it has widescreen support, it's going to work. Now, this is not going to work for every game, so you have to test it one at a time, but I do know that it works with Mario 64. So once we have this configured, we're going to save it for this game. We're going to go up to Manage Core Options, then Save Game Options. That means for Mario 64 specifically, it's going to try to play it in 1080p widescreen. To verify that this is working, we need to close out of the game. So let's go back up here. Let's do Close Content, which is going to close out of the game. We'll also quit out of RetroArch to get back to the main emulation station menu, then go into Mario 64. And now this time it's playing in 1080p, so you can see that Mario has got a higher resolution to him, but then also it's widescreen. You can see that it's filling up the entire display. So this is going to be amazing. Like I said, not many Nintendo 64 games have this support, but for those that do, yes, you can play it like that. So it's worth experimenting to see if they work. Okay, so that's about it when it comes to RetroArch. It's probably the most involved system to set up, but I did show you how to do things like setting up shaders as well as BFI, and then also how to configure some of those higher end emulators. So this should be pretty good for most of those systems. Next, we're going to jump into the standalone emulators and configure those one by one. Okay, when it comes to these standalone apps, we're going to tackle these one at a time. I'll leave chapters for each of them down below so you can pick and choose which ones you want to install. This is going to be a long process, so definitely just take it one bite at a time. Usually I like to start with the easier systems and work our way up, but unintuitively, we're actually going to start with Eden, but there's a good reason for it. So let's do this first, Nintendo Switch emulation. When you first open up this app, it's going to ask you to grant permissions. Go ahead and do that. And on the next page, it's going to ask for all of your emulator data. So first is going to be your keys. These are going to be those BIOS files that we talked about earlier. So you want to navigate to where you have them. If you remember, on our microSD card, I put them in the ROMs folder and then BIOS underneath that. So here within the BIOS folder, you can see that I have my prod.keys file, so I'm going to select that one. The firmware file is not required, but I do also recommend this, and I also have it in my BIOS folder. You can see it right here. And like I mentioned before, I'm using 19.0.1. Once that's installed, it's going to ask you to add your games folder. So this is going to be in our ROMs folder and then under Nintendo Switch. Once you find the Switch folder and you open it up, you can select use this folder and then allow, and then it will be all good. Once you hit next, it's going to take you to this done page, and then we can go to get started. It'll then scan through your ROM folder and then find all of your games. By default, it's going to look like this, and you can navigate through your games this way, or if you would like, you can see them in a grid. So I generally will do this instead, and so this is how I can see all my games. So now let's go into these settings and make some configurations. The first is going to be our controls. We want to make sure that we can actually play our games. We'll go into Player 1, and then under Auto Map a Controller, you should be able to find your controller. You can see mine right here. Once you select that, it's going to auto map everything, and so if you scroll down a little bit more, you should see a bunch of buttons are assigned. What I found is that if you have it in Xbox mode, the ABXY buttons will be reversed. So if we click on this and then press on the A button, you'll see that it shows 97 instead of 96. So we need to change each of these ones. Once you've adjusted your ABXY patterns to match the Nintendo Switch, this is basically all you have to do. Everything else should be set up correctly. In the advanced settings, one other thing I recommend doing is go into the system section, and by default, it's going to be docked mode turn off, but the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 that's found in the Retroid Pocket 6 is powerful enough that you can play most games in docked mode, so I usually turn this one on. One other change in the graphics settings, I recommend going down here, and then there's an option for asynchronous shader caching. You'll find it near the end of the graphics settings, and if you turn this one on, it often will reduce stutters, but it might introduce some glitches with certain games, so you may want to make a per game configuration if you see any glitches. You can also adjust the performance overlay if you want to see your stats while you're playing, frames per second, frame time, all these things can be adjusted right here as well. It really depends on what you want to see as you're playing. It's also worth noting that you can make per game settings as well. You can press and hold the game, and then under here, under settings, you can then make any adjustments here. So for example, if a game doesn't really work well in docked mode, you can turn that one off. Or if you want to go into the graphics settings and change things like upscaling, you can do that here as well. Now, the reason why we're installing Eden first is because it has a really handy GPU driver manager within its settings. So if you click on this and then go into the fetch on the bottom left, it's going to show you that it finds the GPU model that you have with your device and then a recommended Turnip driver for that specific model. This is really handy because it not only allows you to download and install the actual driver right then and there, but it also gives you an idea of what you can go and find to download to use with other apps too. So that's why we're doing it first. In this case, it's recommending the Mr. Purple T23 drivers, which I found right here. So I can go to show downloads, and then I can just download this right here. It's going to download it from their server, and it's going to install it as well. And then we can also make a note of the Mr. Purple T23 drivers that we can download later to use in other apps too. And you're not just limited to these drivers that they recommend, there's a whole list of them down below, like the Game Hub drivers, the Kimchi drivers, and so you can navigate through these and also add these as well, and then choose these on a per game basis. For this chipset in particular, I found the Mr. Purple T23 does a great job, so we're just going to stick with that one. If we go back, you will now see that it says that the shaders have been cleared here, so you can just hit OK, no problem there. And you can see that now it's selected those Turnip drivers, and so we can just go with those instead of the system driver. I think it's a really cool feature. And then like I mentioned, you can also just download a bunch of different ones and try those out, and you can save them on a per game basis like we did earlier with the graphics settings. A really handy feature is that you can manage the Eden data very easily, so if you go in here, you can install game content like updates or DLC right here. And then another thing I often will do is I'll export the save games that I have on one specific device and then import them then right here on a new device as I get it. So that's why I'm able to play my save games on other devices. And that's about it when it comes to setting up Eden in the first place. Let's start up a game and just make sure that everything is working properly. By default, when the game first starts up, you'll see that it shows these controls. So let's get rid of those. We're going to press the back button here and then select hide controller. That's it. You don't really have to do anything else. The game should run just fine. So that's it for Nintendo Switch emulation. Pretty easy to set up. It's really just the challenge of finding the Switch files and then also your prod keys and firmware. To exit out of game, you just press the back button and then go down to the bottom. There's exit emulation, just tap on that. So now that we know which Turnip drivers are the best, while we still have those fresh in our mind, let's go ahead and download them individually. So we're going to search for the words Mr. Purple Turnip, which is going to bring up the repository right here on GitHub. And if you remember, it was the T23 drivers that we want. So let's just scroll down to T23, then find the assets. And then right there, you should see your zip file. And so all you have to do is just grab this. There are a couple other apps that will use these Turnip drivers, including the next one that we're going to do, which is Wii U. This is also an easy app to set up, and it works really well with the Retroid Pocket 6. So we're going to open it up. You're not going to see anything at first. You're going to click on the menu icon here, and then go into Settings, and then under General Settings, there'll be one that says Add Game Path. So we're going to click on this. And then we want to go and hit the plus button again. A lot of clicks here. And then you want to go over to your microSD card, find your ROMs folder, and then your Wii U folder. Once you've got that folder open, you can select Use This Folder, and then go and allow access, and that's it. That's all you have to do, so we can go back into the main menu, and you should see the games populate here. Once you've got your games loaded, let's go into the settings, make some adjustments. We'll first go into Input Settings, and by default, the controller one is going to be disabled, so we want to enable this, and you got the choice of the Wii U gamepad or the Pro Controller, or the Classic Controller. The Pro Controller doesn't work on every single game, so I often will just use the Wii U gamepad. This one will set up all your buttons for you, so if you do set up all inputs and then select your controller, then it should show this all down below. Same thing with like the Nintendo Switch, the ABXY buttons will be different if you are using the Xbox layout style, so you have to go in and just map those four individually. But once you have those four selected, that's all you have to do, so the controllers are now set up. In the graphics settings, this is where we're going to add our custom drivers. So you can see that right here, and then we can go and hit the plus button on the top right, and then find in the downloads folder those Mr. Purple drivers that we had downloaded before. So they're right here. We're going to select those. Now you just want to make sure this one is the default one, and you should now be good to go. This really improves performance with certain games, including Breath of the Wild. If you want to see your frames per second and other metrics, you can go into the overlay settings, and then you can turn this one on. I usually put it in the top right, and then you can adjust the scale of it. I usually do 150 to 200%, so that way it's nice and big. And then you can turn on what you want to see, for example, frames per second, or the CPU usage, or the RAM usage. It all depends on what you want to monitor as you're playing a game, and of course this is all optional. And that's all you'll have to do in the regular settings. So let's back out now and check out the graphics pack. This is a really important factor. When you first start it up, you have to hit this download button that's going to download the latest graphics packs for Wii U. And once you have that downloaded, you'll see a listing of all your games right here. If it does have supported graphics packs, not everyone does. And what you can do within here is adjust things based on the game itself and what it allows. So if we go into Mario Tennis, you can see that the only thing you can change here is the resolution and the shadow resolution. By default, you can see that it's going to be set at 720p. But we can actually change this to 1080p if we would like to match the display of this device, and it's got enough power to be able to handle it. Same thing with shadow resolution. By default, it's going to be medium, but if you've got enough juice and you want to have it look a little bit better, you could do high shadows too. For other games like Breath of the Wild, you have much more robust settings. For example, cheats. So if you wanted to have like infinite durability, you can go in here, enable, and then change the modifier. and make it unbreakable, so then all of your weapons will no longer break. If you're going to play this game on Wii U, which is the way that I like to play it, then I do recommend going into the mod section, go to FPS++, turn this one on, and then make it, instead of normal settings, go to advanced settings, and then under frame rate limit, I like to set this to 40 frames per second. That usually gives me a smoother experience overall. Another thing I like to do to improve performance is to go into graphics, turn this one on here. You can upscale the resolution, but I think it really affects the performance, so I leave it at 720p. But then under shadows, I put this down to low shadows. I don't really care about how nice the shadows look, and this allows it to improve the performance overall. Same thing with the shadow draw distance. I usually leave this at medium instead, and it's not going to make the shadows look very good, but at the same time, it's not something that I really focus on when I'm playing this game in particular, so I'd like to have a higher frame rate if possible. And so that's how the graphics packs work, and you can adjust this on a per game basis, and I would recommend messing around with those for each of your games. So here we are with DuckTales Remastered. It's looking pretty good to me, and if you want to, you can swipe from the left to bring up the options menu. So one of the things that you may want to do is replace your TV with the pad. This means that if you're playing something where it says, look on the gamepad, for example, to save a game within Wind Waker, so you'd want to set this up, click on this, and that's going to show the Wii U gamepad instead. If you're playing a game that has motion control support like Breath of the Wild, you can turn this one on as well. But other than that, there's not a lot you can do other than just obviously exit out of the app. Okay, we've set up Eden and Cemu at this point. Let's move over to Sony and talk about PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2 with these two apps. They're very similar in their configuration, so we'll start with PS2 and then do DuckStation. There are two different versions of Neither SX2. There's one called Patch and one called Classic, and over the years I've found that the Classic one usually has the best compatibility, so this is the one I use the most, but there are some games that don't run super well with this. For example, Champions of Norath, you'd want to use the Patch version for that, and I think Gran Turismo 4 works better with the Patch version too, but the Classic one I found works better with other games like Sly Cooper. The unfortunate thing is you can only have one installed at a time, so you can't have them both and swap between the two. So in general, I just stick with the classic version, but if you are trying to play a game and it's not running well on this particular chipset or device, then definitely go and try the patch one instead. Either way, let's go ahead and start with the setup. So we're going to hit next here. It's going to give you some FAQ. We can hit next. And then it has a couple settings that we can adjust right here in the beginning. For the Retroid Pocket 6, I would recommend leaving it at optimal safe defaults. And then under GPU renderer, I do recommend using OpenGL because it's more accurate and we can adjust this on a per game basis if we run into any issues. And then finally, under upscale multiplier, I changed this to 2.5 resolution. This is going to give us a 1080p output. After that, we can hit next. It's going to ask us, where are your BIOS files? So we're going to click on this one here and then navigate to the micro SD card, then our ROMs folder, and then our BIOS folder. Once you're in the BIOS folder, scroll down until you find the PS2 BIOS. It's the one that's going to be about 4 megabytes, so we can click on this one. And then once it imports, you want to select it, and then we can hit next. Now it's going to ask us where the game directories are, so we're going to go back into the ROMs folder, then find the PS2 folder. Once you find that, you can open it up, select use this folder, and then allow, and that's it. Now if we hit next, it should say that setup is complete. We can hit finish. It's going to take a minute to scrub through all of your games, and then you should see them right here on the main page. I personally use CHD files for my PS2 games. They're going to be more compressed, and they work super well. I've got a whole guide about that I mentioned earlier. I'll have that linked in the written guide down below. Okay, once the games show up, I'm going to show you one trick to get the box art to show up in case you just want to see them. It doesn't really matter since we're going to be using Emulation Station, but if you want to see those, let's set that up. So you're going to go to Download Covers, and by default with this app, it's actually already got them listed, but you can't hit the download button for some reason. So what you have to do is click on this text and then find one of these things and then just delete a letter and then add the letter back in. It's the dumbest thing in the world, but once you do that, you can then hit download. It's going to download all the box art for each of your games. And so there you go. Now we've got all this fancy box art. You can even click on this button over here to make it even look like you're navigating through an old PlayStation setup. So yeah, just one little nice thing that you can do. It's very easy to set up. Now let's adjust the settings. There's not a lot we have to do here, but let's go into the app settings first. And under the general section, if you want to see all of your stats, your frames per second and whatnot, this is where you would turn them on. You can see frames per second, speed, resolution, the version of the app, and all that stuff can be shown at once. If you want to make it a little bit bigger, on the very bottom, you can adjust the OSD scale. I usually use it like something like 250% when I'm showing it off in a video, but it's really all going to be up to you. Under the system tab, this is where you can adjust the underclocking. This is if a game is not performing performing well. The Retroid Pocket 6 does not generally have to use this at all, but if you're using something older like the Retroid Pocket 5, then I would recommend, if you are having problems with a certain game running at full speed, is to adjust the underclocking here, but we don't really have to worry about it with the Retroid Pocket 6. So next we're going to go into graphics settings. I already set up most of this stuff, OpenGL 2.5 resolution, but there are two things I like to turn on, and it's right here. Enable widescreen patches, and then no interlacing patches. I always turn these two on, so if the game does support widescreen, it'll show in 16:9. Now, if you are running into any performance issues with PS2 games on this particular chip, it often will not be the underclocking that'll fix it. It's going to be the hardware download mode. So if you are playing a game and it's not working correctly, like Gran Turismo 4, one that often will have some problems, what you can do here is adjust one of these on a per game basis, and that will often fix things. So with GT4, I know in particular that disabling the hardware download mode usually gives you the best results. So that's something to consider. And I'll show you how to set this up as a per game basis here in a minute. The other thing I recommend in the app settings is achievements. So they've got retro achievements for Neither SX2 Classic 2. So you can turn this one on, and then you can scroll down a little bit, and then there's your login information right here. So you can add all of this stuff if you want. And once you're logged in, that's all you have to do. So pretty easy there. So let's go back into the main menu now, and let's go into the controller settings. It's the last thing we have to adjust. First thing, go into the touchscreen section, and we want to make sure those touchscreen controls don't show up. So we're going to do hide with external controller. From there, go into controller port 1, and then there's an automatic mapping option. You should find your controller right there, click on it, and all this should work fine, including the ABXY button. So that's all you have to do. On the far right of the controller settings are your hotkey settings. So I do recommend setting up some of these. I've got a diagram right here, which is also going to be in the written guide that shows you all of the ones that I set up, but we'll also do this individually. First thing, I want to set up fast forward, but I like to do the toggle frame limit. That means it's going to run as fast as it possibly can, as opposed to fast forward, which only goes to, I think, 200% by default. So this will go up to like 400% depending on the game. When you click on it, it's going to ask, all right, what buttons do you want to push? And you can use any combination of buttons, but what I like to do is select an R2 to match what we have on RetroArch. So this means we can press select an R2 at any point to turn on fast forward, and we can press it again to turn it off. Scrolling down a bit, there's the open pause menu. So this will bring up the menu. You can just press the back button. It'll do the same thing, but I often will select this for select an X, the same thing on RetroArch. Same thing with quick load and quick save. So this is going to match RetroArch. So select an L1 for quick load and select an R1 for quick save. Scrolling down a bit more, we have these three options right here to increase the upscale or downscale. So if you want to make the graphics a little bit worse to see if that improves performance, or make it better if you're going to upscale it, say to 4K, if you're going to plug it into a TV, you can do that on the fly with these hotkeys. I also like to do the cycle aspect ratio one, which allows me to change it between 4:3 and 16:9, depending on what I'm playing. Now, the way I like to set these up is with the D-pad. It makes intuitive sense for me. So I can press up to increase the upscale, down to decrease it, and then right to cycle the aspect ratio. Now, pressing select and then up on the D-pad is a little bit awkward. You have to move your right hand over to the left side of the controller, and that can be really weird while you're in the middle of a game. So instead, I like to map this to the start button. So if we go back into the menu here, I tap on it, I press start and up right here. It's a little bit weird to have to use a different hotkey, but because we can use multiple controller inputs with this particular app, it actually works out pretty well. So same thing here, I'm going to press start and down, and then start and right for the cycle aspect ratio. And so that's it when it comes to setting up your hotkeys. I would really like to have the ability to quit out of the app every time that I press a certain hotkey, but unfortunately they don't have that one set up. One other thing you could do if you wanted, but something that I don't normally do, is you can go into the app settings right here, and there's an option right here, save state on shutdown. So if you wanted to auto save your game when you close it, you can do that right here. It's not going to auto load the game when you start it up, but you can just press select an L1 once the game is booted, and then you can actually use that save state. Okay, so let's start up a game. Let's do Midnight Club 3 Dub Edition. Once you start up the game, it'll probably say something like whether or not there are any widescreen patches that are active. You'll also see this banner that says, you know, if you paid for this, you shouldn't have, that kind of thing. Okay, so here we are in the game, and obviously we can just play it and enjoy it as it is, but let's say we want to make some adjustments to it. So first thing I want to do is press either select an X or the back button to bring up this menu. So the only major thing you'll probably do within the settings is either just exit out of the game so you can go back to the menu, or you're going to press the I button right here. This is the per game settings. You can also do the cogwheel. This is going to be the entire app settings. So if you change something here, it's going to affect all the games. But if we only want to affect this one game that we're playing, press on the I button here. So for example, if you want to go into the graphics settings and you decided that OpenGL isn't working correctly, so you can change this over to Vulkan instead, and so that's what's going to use instead. Same thing with the upscale multiplier. Maybe you want it to not be at 2.5, but only 2x resolution. You can set this, and so every time you start up the game, it's going to run at that resolution instead. And then, like I mentioned before, the hardware download mode, this is where you can adjust certain games if they're not running properly, and you can test each one of these out and see if it works better. Same thing with blending accuracy. If you're playing a game and it just looks fuzzier than you would expect, then often if you set this to high instead of basic, it will often look a little bit sharper. This is more demanding on the CPU, so I wouldn't do this on every single game, but it is something that you can set on a per game basis. And so really that's about it for PlayStation 2. It's a pretty easy setup, all things considered. One of the best things about this particular device is that it does a very good job when playing these games. Now let's do DuckStation. It's a very similar process here. That's why I'm going to do these side by side. When you first start it up, it's going to ask you to add a game directory. So let's go ahead here, go into the micro SD card, then ROMs, then PS1. Within ESDE, it's going to be labeled as PSX. That's going to be the folder you're going to put everything in, then select use this folder and then allow. Now, unfortunately, even though this app has the ability to download box art like we saw earlier, this one doesn't have the URL listed, and I'm not really sure where to go, so it's not going to be as simple as the PS2 one, which is kind of unfortunate. Next, let's add the BIOS files. It may prompt you when you first start up the app, but it didn't for me, so the way that I usually will do this is I just start the BIOS, and it's going to say, hey man, you don't have any BIOS, so we're going to hit yes here, and then we're going to go into the ROMs and then the BIOS folder. And these are my PS1 BIOS right here, so I'm going to click on this, and then it's going to say that they're imported. Next, let's go into the app settings and make some adjustments here. So this is going to be pretty easy. For example, under interface, you can add your things like frames per second and whatnot like we did before with PS2. Under the system section at the very bottom, they actually have run ahead available. So this is going to improve the input latency. So if you want to try this out, you can set it to 1 frame. In the graphics section, I found that the GPU renderer set to automatic works the best, but under internal resolution, this is going to be a matter of personal choice. So you can set this to whatever you would like. It's a lot like with Dreamcast and Nintendo 64 we were talking about earlier. You can upscale it to 1080p and have like a high resolution version of the game, or you can make it a little bit chunkier and then maybe add a CRT shader, which we'll do here in a second. So if you click on this, you will see that there's all the way up to a 5x scale, which is going to be 1080p, or you can do like 3x for 720p. I often will do 3x, so it's kind of like in the middle ground where it's a little bit sharper, but not to the point of being like high resolution. While you're in here, also scroll down a little bit and you can turn on widescreen rendering if there are games that support it. And you can also turn on PGXP geometry correction, which improves the whole wobbly polygon thing that happened on PS1, so I definitely recommend that. There are other things that you can mess around with, like accurate blending or forcing 4:3 for videos and stuff, but I usually just leave these all at the default and it works pretty well. Now, under the post-processing section, this is where you can enable shaders. So if we turn this one on, we can add a shader. I like this second one right here, CTR Lot 2. You've got a bunch of different options, but this is just the one that we're going to use right now. So this is going to add a shader to the overall chain. If you scroll down to the bottom, you can adjust the CRT shader. For example, it has warping turned on. This is going to make it look a little bit rounded in the edges, kind of like an old CRT television, but I personally don't really like that much with this particular emulator, so I'm going to turn that one off. You can make other fine-tune adjustments, like adjusting the warping however you would like, or you can turn on CRT saturation. You've got quite a few options depending on what you prefer. But otherwise, I just leave it at the default, and so let's go over to achievements. So same thing with PS2, we can go and turn on our achievements here and then log in. And then from there, we can have retro achievements with this particular app. So it's all up to you, but yes, you can log in right here, and that's basically all you need to do. Now back in the menu, let's go over to the controller settings. So same setup here, it's actually almost identical. So we can go to touchscreen, then go down here and then auto hide the touchscreen controller. And then under port 1, we want to do automatic mapping, and we want to select our controller, which is this one. The mapping here will be correct on that too, so let's just go over to hotkeys. This one's a little bit different, but not by much. So it doesn't have a frame limit. So instead, we're just going to do toggle fast forward. This is going to be selecting R2. The diagram that I have set up for PlayStation 2 is actually the same thing that I use for PlayStation 1. So here under quick load and quick save, I do select an L1 for quick load and select an R1 for quick save. Under the toggle widescreen, I make this start and right, much like we were doing the cycle aspect ratio earlier with PS2. So this is going to turn on or off widescreen if it's supported. And then also that increase and decrease resolution scale if we want to increase or decrease the resolution. Very simple here, just start and up and down on the D-pad. And then finally, at the very bottom, there's the open pause menu. So again, this is select an X for me, but you can always just press the back button on the device too. And that's really it when it comes to configuration for DuckStation. So let's start up a game and make sure everything works. When it first starts up, you will see that it'll show your retro achievements, as you can see right here. And then the game itself should just start right up. Okay, once we start up a game, as you can see here, everything looks pretty good. It's in 4:3, but we also have that CRT shader that's working right now. And so this is at a 3x resolution upscale, but also with that CRT shader, I think it looks good. It's a nice mix of modern and retro. The only other thing you may want to do while playing a game is turn on the widescreen. So we can do that by pressing start and right with our hotkey. And so then it'll enable, and you can see right here, now we're playing the game in widescreen. So it's really up to you and what you prefer to play and whether or not the game actually supports it. Sometimes it's just going to stretch the screen, but other times it'll actually work. You can see here with the 8th down here on the bottom how it's a little bit off. That's because the widescreen hack basically made everything work properly other than the lettering right here. If we press it again, you can see that yes, now the 8th actually looks correct. And so just one of those things that you may have to live with if you try widescreen hacks. Another important factor with PS1 games is that many of them are multi-disc, so you can press the back button or select an X to bring up the menu, and then there's a change disc option right here. So if you have multiple discs installed, you can go and actually choose them one by one. Another important thing is if you're playing DualShock games like Ape Escape, you can toggle the analog mode on right here. Other than that, that's really about it when it comes to PS1. It's a pretty simple process altogether, especially after you've already set up PS2. Sticking with the Sony theme, let's do PlayStation Portable next. You can play this one in RetroArch, and you've got enough juice to be able to do that within this app, but I really do prefer this standalone emulator. I think it's great. When you first start it up, it's going to ask you, where are you going to put your PSP data folder? So this is going to essentially keep all of your save games and your settings and everything else, and you can put them either on skip for now, which means it's going to be stored internally on the device, but it's hard to access that later, or you can just make your own folder, which is really handy. And if you make your own PSP folder, that means that you can use it on other devices too. It's very easy to access. So you can move this to a new microSD card or just move that microSD card over into a new device and then point to it within the PSP emulator, and then you'll have all your saved games and your configurations already good to go. So what I usually will do is I'll hit OK right here, and then it wants to navigate to wherever you want to save it. I usually put it in the actual microSD card. I go into ROMs, and then I just go into the PSP folder. You honestly can put it wherever you want, but I found that if you put it within here, it's just going to make a lot more intuitive sense, and it doesn't conflict with the games themselves. So I'm going to select use this folder. It'll make its own PSP folder and everything else. After that, just hit OK, and you should be good to go. It's going to go back into the app. Once you hit OK, it's going to take you to this main menu. So the first thing I like to do is navigate to where my games are located. Now, what I usually do here is I hit Browse, and then Emulation Station Desktop Edition sometimes has a hard problem finding this folder unless you go back to the root directory of the microSD card, then find the ROMs folder, and then go back into the PSP folder. So even though it shows you the PSP folder right there in the beginning, you've actually got to manually navigate to it just that one time. Once you select use this folder and allow it access, you should see all your games populate right here. Once they're all loaded up, what I do is I press this plus button, which means it's going to save this location for later. So next time when we open up this app, you can see all your games right here and there. Now, honestly, there's not a lot of settings changes you have to do for PPSSPP. It's really well configured right out of the gate. The number one thing I would recommend doing is changing out the rendering resolution. By default, it's going to be 2x, but we can go up to 4x because this is a 1080p display. Everything else works really well, so I wouldn't adjust anything other than on the very bottom. If you want to see your frames per second and how fast the game is running, you can turn that on right here. In the controls section, it's the same thing where there's not a lot that you need to adjust other than the fact that because it's on Android, by default, it's going to show you on-screen touch control, so I'd like to turn this one off. Same thing under control mapping. All of this is going to work already by default, other than the fact that I love to add the start and select to close out of the game. So I do combo mappings right here, and then I scroll down until it says exit app. Then you can hit this button right here and then press select and start. And so it's going to work like RetroArch, where I press select and start to exit the app, and that is it. By default, these are going to be your hotkeys to get into the menu. You press L2 just on its own, it'll open it up, and then R2 will do fast forward. If you want to have it perfectly sync with RetroArch, you could always just make this a combo mapping. So you could do select an X to bring up the pause menu and select an R2 to do the fast forward. But I've just gotten used to this over the years, and so it's really going to be up to you, but you could adjust these if you would like. The only other thing that I would say you can change within this app is you can go into tools and then retro achievements. So you can log in here, same thing with the other apps. So just go ahead and enable it and then add your username and password. You'll be good to go. So now let's start up a game and see how everything looks. We'll do Virtual Tennis World Tour. First thing, it'll show you whether or not the game has any achievements, and it's still pretty nascent when it comes to achievements on PSP, so many games aren't supported just yet, but you can see here it's showing our frames per second and our speed, and the game itself is running just fine. If we press the L2 button, it'll bring up the menu, and this is where we can do a save state. We can also set this up with hotkeys if you'd like, but it's so simple to do it right here that I just do it here usually. And then of course, if we press and hold the R2 button, it'll go into fast forward, and you can see it's running running at like 1000% if we need to get through a menu or whatever. To exit out of game like we showed already, just press select and start, and that's it. Next, let's configure Dolphin. This is one of the harder emulators to set up because of the Wii controls, but I'll get you covered at least with the basics here. When you first get into it, I like to add my games first, so we're going to go here, go into the microSD card, find the ROMs folder, and then GameCube. This folder will be labeled as GC, so you can open that one up, then use this folder and allow, and then it should start to show all of your GameCube games right now. Once they're all loaded, it should also download the box art for you on the fly, so it looks pretty neat. Next, we can go back to add games, and this time let's add our Wii games. We'll go back to the ROMs folder, scroll all the way down to Wii, and then find that one. Same thing here, we'll select use this folder and allow, and then to give it a minute and it'll actually show up. To find the actual Wii games, you got to go over to the Wii section and they should show right here. Sometimes the games won't actually download the box art, so I found the workaround for that is to start up the game and then close it, and that will usually work pretty well. Now that we've added our games, let's do some configuration. And so first thing, go into the config section and then general, and make sure that the dual core thing is turned on. And then also I like to enable cheats in case you want to use those later. And then at the very bottom, there's the ability to enable save states, so I often will use that. I also will use the fallback region to NTSCU. That way the game is going to be guaranteed playing at 60 frames per second if it's supported by the game. After that, I like to go into the interface section. So this is where you can turn off panic handlers. So if something goes wrong with the emulation, you'll get this pop-up that say like, hey, something went wrong. And often it will not cause the game to crash. And so it just becomes annoying. And so what I do is I turn this off, but if the game does end up crashing, it won't give you a notification ahead of time. It's just going to crash. So just another thing to keep in mind. Other than that, there's not a lot that we can change here other than the fact that they now have retro achievements within Dolphin. So we can do that here too. As I'm making this video, once you've logged in, I have found there is one bug. By default, it's going to say that you have hardcore mode turned on, even if you don't have this turned on. So what you have to do is turn this on and then turn it off. Once you do that, everything usually is okay. And that's really it when it comes to retro achievements. Pretty simple setup. Now let's go into the graphics settings. So this is where we're going to make quite a few changes. By default, I usually leave this at OpenGL because there are many games that won't run very well with Vulkan, even though the performance is better. This has the better compatibility, and we've got the chipset with enough power to be able to play OpenGL for most of these games. We can set this as a per game basis. We'll do that later just to show you how that works. One thing I like to do is compile the shaders before starting. That means that it's going to have a little bit longer in loading up the game the first time, but it's going to make it a little bit less stuttery when you're actually playing. Under enhancements, this is where we're going to adjust our resolution. We don't have a 2.5x option, unfortunately, so our only option here is 3x native. This is a pretty high resolution. It's a little bit higher than we need for this particular screen, but it usually works pretty well. If you're using a lower powered device than the Retroid Pocket 6 under hacks, one option that I do recommend is VBI skip. This means that it will have less audio stuttering in general if the game is struggling. These games are not going to struggle with this chipset with the Retroid Pocket 6, so you don't have to turn this one on, but it's really going to be up to you. Now under statistics, we can add in our frames per second and the frame time, things like that, if you want to see them. And then finally, under GPU driver, we can actually load our own Turnip driver. So same thing like we did with Wii U, we can go back into our download folder, find that Mr. Purple one that we got earlier, and then just select that. Now, this is only going to work when you're playing with the Vulkan backend, and sometimes it'll cause more glitches than not. So it's really going to be up to you. If you try to play a game with the Vulkan backend and it's still having issues, then you can always just go back to the default. Now we need to put in our input controls. This is where things get a little bit wonky because the GameCube and the Wii had very unique setups. Here's a look at the GameCube diagram, and the most important thing to look at is the ABXY pattern that we have on the right, and that is because the setup with this controller, which you can see on the top right, was a little bit different than the modern control schemes. And so what I do here is I put the A button here in the center, the B button on the left, the X on the right, and then the Y button up above. If you look at the GameCube controller, that's probably the closest approximation that you can actually get, as opposed to looking at the letters on the controller itself and then just mapping them accordingly. So it is a little bit odd looking, but that's just kind of how I've gotten used to playing GameCube on this particular controller. So let's set up our GameCube controller. We're going to click on this, and then over on the right, we're going to click on the cog. And by default, it should show under device, the Xbox wireless controller, everything is good. And then we need to map our buttons manually. Again, look at that diagram and then just map them according to that. So the A button is going to be your bottom button on the ABXY. The B button is going to be on the left. The X button will be on the right. And then the Y button is the top button. And then we have the start button, which is going to be start. There is no select button on the GameCube controller. For control stick, this is going to be your left analog stick. So just map these accordingly. And then same thing with the C stick. This is your right analog stick. So just map them there. Now for for triggers, the GameCube controller had an analog input. So all you have to do here is just for L, use the L2, and then for the L analog, use L2 again. This means that when you press the trigger halfway, it's going to be that analog input, and then if you press it all the way, it's the same thing as clicking down on that GameCube controller for games like Super Mario Sunshine. Just do the same thing with the R2 button and you should be good. At the very bottom is your D-pad inputs, so this is pretty self-explanatory, but just add those and that's it. So setting up the GameCube controller is not the worst thing in the world that's actually set up properly. It's the Wii input that's really a big pain in the butt. The problem comes into the fact that we've got motion controls and we've got a pointer as well as the nunchuck and the other accessories too. So we're going to set this up as much as possible with the controller itself. You can go really further into it and actually put in motion controls and whatnot, but I've never found that to be a very good experience. Instead, I actually made a video showing how to set up a Wiimote with one of these devices. So I would recommend just checking out that video. I'll leave a link down below as part of that written guide. So what we're going to do in this video is set it up to be able to use nunchuck controls in the best way possible. We'll also set it up to be able to use the classic controller and then also just the Wiimote on its own. And that's going to cover the vast majority of games you would probably play on a portable console anyway. So let's go into Wii Input. And now under Wii Remote, let's click on the cog. And so the first thing we want to do is set up our first profile, and let's do the nunchuck extension because that's already set up by default. So first thing, go into the buttons, and let's go back to this diagram to see how the buttons are laid out because it's not going to make a lot of intuitive sense until you actually start playing a game. So if you look at the Wiimote, the A button was that top button on the actual Wiimote itself. So we're going to set this one as the primary button, which is the bottom button on the ABXY. The B button on the Wiimote was that little trigger that we had underneath. We're going to set that up as X. That's usually going to work the best. The buttons down below are the 1 and 2, and sometimes you'll use those in like a nunchuck style game, but often you would just tilt the Wiimote over to the left side, and those would become your A and B buttons. So we will map those accordingly, but with the X and Y buttons. So back in the menu here, for the A button, we're going to make this the bottom button on the ABXY pattern, then the B button is going to be the left one, the 1 button is going to be the top one, and then the 2 button is going to be the right one. Select and minus are just going to be your select and start buttons, so a pretty easy add there. And the D-pad should make intuitive sense as well. It's just going to follow the actual D-pad on your device. Now for the games that expect you to rotate the Wiimote like New Super Mario Bros. Or Super Paper Mario, then we're going to use a sideways toggle, which I use as the R3 button, so that's going to be pressing down on the right analog stick. This is important because it'll rotate the D-pad so those games work properly. Other than that, that's all the buttons that we can adjust right in this setting, so now we're going to scroll down to the motion simulation. Here we can set the pointer of the Wiimote itself, which I use with the right analog stick. So just go in here and adjust these with those stick controls. One other thing I like to do is near the bottom, you'll see an option that says shake for X, Y, and Z. And so if you ever need to like shake your Wiimote for a specific thing like Donkey Kong Country, I set all of these to R1. So now let's go back to the main input menu. And now under extension, we want to adjust all of this stuff. By default, it'll be the nunchuck. So let's go and set that up first. Going back to the diagram, if you look at the nunchuck, the C and Z buttons are the main buttons, and I use these with L1 and L2. So we just need to go in here and then set the C button as L1 and then the Z button as L2. For the stick, this is going to be your nunchuck stick, which is your main input. So this is going to be your left analog stick, and just set these up accordingly. The nunchuck can also be shaken, and so I set this also to R1. That means that when you press the R1 button, the app is going to think that you're just shaking everything possible, and that often will work really well with games like Donkey Kong Country. That's all we really have to do for the nunchuck, so that's actually pretty good to go. We don't have to mess with anything else. So the next thing we want to do is near the top, there's a profiles option. We want to set up different profiles for different input methods. So far, we have set up the Wiimote and the nunchuck, so let's make that a profile first. We're going to click on this, and then you'll see a save button right here. We're going to tap on that. And you can name this whatever you want, but I usually just do Wiimote with nunchuck. Once you have that saved, hit OK. And now we want to make another profile, and the easiest one right now is just to make the Wiimote only. So the way you do this is you go back down here, and then under extension, set this to none. Now go back to profiles, and then we're going to save a new one. This time we're going to name it Wiimote only. Once you have that, hit done and then OK. And now we've got these two different profiles. The last profile I would recommend setting up is going to be our classic controller extensions. We're going to go back here into extensions and then do classic, and then go over to the cog, and then we need to assign all these buttons. Thankfully, this is a very intuitive setup because all of these buttons are going to match exactly like a modern control scheme. And so set these up like it would be with a Nintendo Switch with the A button on the right side and so on. Now for ZL and ZR, I set these up as L1 and R1 because the later buttons, the L and R buttons, can actually be analog inputs depending on the controller that you're mimicking. And so let's do that instead. Select and minus will be your start and select buttons, very easy. and then just map the analog sticks accordingly. It's very intuitive. Once you get into the triggers, this is where I was talking about earlier, where you can use the same thing like with GameCube, where you can do L and L analog as being both L2 and then R2, same thing. Finally, you got the D-pad, and that's about it. So once you've gone through and made those adjustments, go back to the main menu. Let's now save a new profile. So we're going to go back here and hit save. And this time I'm going to call it Classic Controller for obvious reasons and hit OK, and there we go. Believe it or not, that's all we got to do for the Wii setup. So we are now good to go. We can go back into the main menu. So when it comes to GameCube games, it'll be a pretty easy experience. You just click on the game, it's going to start right up. By default, it's going to show you these on-screen controls. We can press the back button here and then get rid of them. So we want to go down to overlay controls, then we want to go to toggle controls and then toggle all. That's going to get rid of all of them there. Okay, so here we are in a game and everything is working nicely, but by default, the way we have it configured, it's going to play in 4:3, but some of these games do have widescreen hack support, including Mario Kart Double Dash. Let's do that next. Unfortunately, the Android version of Dolphin doesn't have hotkeys, so we can't do all the stuff that we did previously. Instead, we have to do it manually by going into the menu. So we can press the back button, and here we can do like a quick save, for example. Now we're going to do a per game configuration by long pressing on the game and then go into edit game settings. And then under graphics settings, we're going to set up widescreen hacks. Now under aspect ratio, we can set up a force by 16:9, but I found that if you use this option, sometimes it will actually show a little bit of black bars on the left and right or top and bottom. So I actually prefer to do stretch to window so it fills out the entire thing. From there, go down to enhancements, scroll all the way to the bottom, there's the widescreen hack, just turn this one on. This means that for Mario Kart Double Dash, which is a game that, yes, works with widescreen hacks very nicely, it's now going to play in 16:9 with those widescreen hacks turned on. So let's start up the game again. And now we're going to press the back button to get into this and then go quick load. And so here we are back in the game, but it's now running in 16:9 and it's got the widescreen hack turned on. So everything looks really good now. And so this is what you can do with certain games that support it. Not every game is going to run with widescreen hacks, but those that do look very nice. To exit out of the game, you just press the back button on the device and then go into exit emulation. So that's it for GameCube. Pretty easy setup, all things considered. If you're running into any performance problems, for example, you're trying to play Rogue Squadron 2, this is a game that really struggles even on this chipset, so you may want to knock down the resolution. So you'd long press on this one, go into edit game settings, and then under graphics settings, you would want to set this one to enhancements, and then internal resolution to maybe a 2x instead. One game that runs better on Vulkan as opposed to OpenGL is going to be F-Zero GX, so I would recommend edit game settings here, go into the graphics settings, and then video backend, change this one to Vulkan. Another thing that you can do with this game is you can go into config and you can see that in general, the dual core is actually turned off by default with this game because it does make it a little bit less stable, but this really improves performance. So often I will turn this one on and then you might get a couple restarts when you first get the game running, but after that it should run a lot faster. So that's really about it when it comes to GameCube, a pretty easy setup. Let's talk about Wii next. So that's about it for GameCube, pretty easy setup, but Wii U is a bit more work. So let's start with a game that actually supports a GameCube controller, making this very easy. So let's go into Sonic Colors. If you remember, the Wiimote back in the day actually had plug-in options for the GameCube controller itself. That's one of the things that I used to do a lot, was be able to play GameCube games on my old Wii. And so some games like Sonic Colors are just going to work with a GameCube controller, a super simple setup right here. Other games like Mario Kart Wii actually supported the classic controller, which I think is just a more traditional way of playing this game. So we can click on this and then go into edit game settings. And let's set that up. So we're going to go into Wii Input, and then under Emulated Wii Control, let's click on this cog. And then the only thing it lets you do is pick a profile. So we can set it up for the classic controller, and that's it. Other games like Mario Galaxy 2 are designed for a nunchuck input. So we can long press here, go into Edit Game Settings. Same thing here, Wii Input, and then go over to the cog. And then under Profile, just make sure you select Wiimote with nunchuck. And so that's all you really have to do with these games, is just set up whatever control scheme works the best for that particular game. It may take a little bit of research, but after that, you've got the profiles to have it all working. There's a deeper rabbit hole here if you wanted to get further into the weeds, like using a Wiimote, like I talked about before, or you could use a Revolution patch for games like Mario Galaxy 1 and 2, which will allow you to use classic controller inputs. But I think this is probably going to work for the majority of the stuff that you want to do, and obviously if you want to get a little bit deeper into it, you can do that research. Okay, two more emulators to set up. We've got MelonDS and Azahar. Let's do Azahar first. This is a 3DS emulator. It works really well. So first thing, we want to go and change all these permissions. So essentially, you need to get permission to access all your files. And then same thing, it's going to want you to allow notifications, but we already turned off all notifications, so it should be okay. And then it also sometimes will want you to record audio because it wants access to the microphone for certain games that need it. Same thing with the camera. The Retroid Pocket 6 doesn't even have a camera, but we can turn that on anyway. In the next section, it's going to ask for our data folders. This is very similar to the PSP one where we can make a user folder. And I usually will put this in the microSD card in the 3DS folder. So we're going to go into ROMs and then find N3DS, which is where these games are located. And once you have that, just select use this folder and then allow. It's going to create all the folders that it needs within there, and so you should be good to go. Next thing is going to be your applications. This is going to ask you basically where are all of your 3DS games. It's going to be in that same folder, so we can just select use this folder and then allow. And that's it. We can now hit next and then continue, and it should take us to the main page, and it'll show all of our games right here. Older versions of this app required you to rename your files from 3DS over to CCI files, but they went back and changed that option, and so now you can just use 3DS files. You just have to make sure that they are decrypted. Either way, you can see here's a listing of all of my games. So let's go into the settings here and make some adjustments. There's not a lot that we need to change here. First, it's going to be the gamepad, so this you'll have to go in and map each of these one by one. I've got a diagram for this, but it's very intuitive. Just follow the regular patterns and then just set everything up accordingly. When you get to the circle pad options, it's actually pretty easy. It's going to just ask you to click on it and then press up on the joystick and then right on the joystick. So just do that. Instead of having to map all 4 of them, you only have to map 2. Same thing with the D-pad, just press up on the vertical one and then right on the horizontal one. When you get to hotkeys, you have 3 different sections that you can use. You can swap your screen, cycle the layouts, or close the game. It really depends on what you're looking for. I usually found with 3DS that I do cycle layouts with the L3 button, so I click on that. And then for close game, I do R3. That means if I ever tap on the R3 button, it'll close out of the game right there. I find this easier than having to go back to the menu and then select exit and then confirming that you want to close the game. That's it for the gamepad. Let's go into the graphics, and then the API, I usually leave it at OpenGL. This has less stutters, but they are working on a version of Vulkan that's going to have less stutters too, so it's all going to be up to you. I do often do the asynchronous shader compilation too to reduce stutters. Under internal resolution, I set this to a 4x, but you could go all the way up to 5x if you would want, but I found that this looks very good, and I can't really see a difference between 4 and 5x. If you disable the right eye render, this often will improve input latency, so I'd recommend this, but if you get any flickering in a game, then you want to turn that off. In the layout section under landscape screen layout, I usually will change this to the hybrid screens. We can also use the L3 button to cycle through these layouts if you don't want to use that one with that particular game. The only other thing I check is I go into the debug and make sure that VSync is turned off by default, and if this is turned on, it's going to cause additional input latency. This app also has the ability to use a custom GPU driver, so we can use those Mr. Purple Turnip drivers that we were using before. So just select those, and then that will be your main driver. It's not usually necessary, but it's always good to have it just because we can. That's really it when it comes to the settings, so we can go back into the applications menu and then choose a game to launch. When you first start up a game, it's going to have these touchscreen controls. Let's get rid of those. So we're going to go into overlay options, and then we're going to turn off this controller overlay. If you want to see your frames per second, you can turn on the performance overlay. And so then once you're in here, this is what it's going to look like. Let's get into the game so you can see a little bit better. And so this is what the layout's going to look like by default. You're going to have your main screen right here, and then a duplicate of that same screen here, and then your bottom screen down below. You may or may not want to have something like this. So you can press the L3 button to cycle different layouts. You can have it top and bottom. You can have them pushed over to one side. You can have it set up like this, where it has just the bottom screen and the top side, or you can have it just one single screen. It really depends on the game that you are playing. Another option is to have them side by side, and so you can just kind of cycle through all your different options and see which one you prefer. And then, like I mentioned before, I set up the hotkey to press the R3 button to close out of the game. Finally, let's do MelonDS. So this one's also pretty simple to set up. This is for the regular Nintendo DS. So we're going to set our ROM directory by then navigating to the microSD card, the ROMs folder, and then Nintendo DS. And this folder is labeled as NDS in the emulation station menu, and so that's it. Once we've got our games loaded, we can go into the menu right here and then select settings. First thing you want to do under the video settings is go into the renderer here and change this to OpenGL. This will allow you to upscale it. So you can pick whatever you would like. I usually do something like a 5x resolution if you want to have it really sharp. This is going to be quite demanding on the system, so it really depends on what you're looking for. So just kind of adjust it accordingly depending on which performance profile and battery drain you want to actually have. Here you can also have your frames per second shown. It's all up to you. If you scroll down a little bit more, you've got the input section. So this is where we're going to map all of our keys. Once you click on this, you will have to do this manually. So just one button at a time. Again, very intuitive. And I also made that diagram earlier for both Nintendo DS and 3DS, so just use that. For the fast forward button, I use R2 just because it makes sense considering that PSP does the same thing. While you're in here, make sure you turn off the show soft input. That's going to be those touchscreen controls, which we don't need. This app also supports retro achievements, so you can go in here and then log in here. That's really about it when it comes to setting up Nintendo DS, a pretty simple system, so let's go ahead and start up a game. Okay, so here we are in Chrono Triggers. You can see both screens are showing. We've got our main screen right here, and then we've got the bottom screen over on the right side. So very similar to the 3DS setup. If we press the back button, it will allow us to do a save state right here, but otherwise it's going to be mostly the same, but this is where you can also exit out of the game. Okay, at this point, we have set up all of our emulators. There's a couple other things we could do as well, including Game Native or Game Hub for PC gaming, as well as Artemis for game streaming. I have dedicated videos for this, and I think this guide video is getting quite long, so I'm just going to point to those instead because I don't want to make this over 2 hours long. Instead, we've got enough set up here that we can go back to Emulation Station Desktop Edition and actually finally put all of this together so we make this feel like an actual gaming console. Like we already talked about before, if we go through the menu, you can see it's going to show games for wherever you've put games inside of all the folders. And now that we set everything up with each of these individual emulators and assign them accordingly, we should be able to just start each of these up one by one. So if I take Chrono Trigger again, it should launch this game within MelonDS, and sure enough, there it goes. Now if we press the back button and we go into exit, it should close out of this, and then if we close out of that, it should take us back to the Emulation Station menu. And so sometimes it's really seamless, sometimes you actually have to close out of the app one time. So as it stands, we're now able to navigate through each of our different systems and then find them and then launch a game from here. And then same thing again, if you just close out of the app, and it all depends on which app you're using. With here with Dolphin, you got to go down to the bottom, exit emulation, and it may take you back to the app. Just press the A button, the one on the right side, and that'll take you right back to where you were. Now the thing about this setup is I've got all this fancy box art. So let's talk a little bit about how to make Emulation Station a little bit prettier. So first thing, let's talk about themes. We're going to go into the UI settings right here under Theme Downloader. It's going to give you a warning, just hit proceed. And then it's going to give you a list of a bunch of different themes that you can install. And I use a lot of these. Lekful is one of my favorite. Artbook Next is one of mine as well. And you can just kind of shop around and see which ones you like. Let's do Artbook Next. It'll take a second to actually download it. And then also let's install the Canvas one. This one's a really nice configurable one too. So we'll just add these 2 additional themes, but you've got dozens to choose from. Once you've got those, let's go back into the main menu. And now under the theme section, you should see different options. Let's go to Artbook Next first. So we're going to select that one and then back out, and you should see it change. So here we are in the Artbook Next theme, so we can navigate this way. I think it looks pretty cool, but we can make some adjustments too. Go back to UI settings, and then we're going to go into theme color scheme. So because this is an OLED device, we can use the OLED options here. By default, it'll be the screenshots, but we have other options. For example, circuit. This is going to show us all of the different boards from the actual consoles themselves. So let me show you what that looks like. So you can see here, we've actually got the PCB boards like from these original consoles. It's really cool looking, but very green. It's just one of the many cool things you can do within this theme. So let's go back into UI settings, and this time let's change it to the outline one. This is one of my favorites. You've probably seen this in a lot of my other videos. And so this one I think looks really cool. I like the fact that it has this kind of like rainbow color to it. When you go into the games list, it might look a little bit different depending on the theme you're using. You can see by default it's showing the box art, but we can also do some other things too when we scrape it. We'll talk about that later. Let's try a different theme. Let's do Canvas this time. This is one that I often will use as well because this one has a different feeling to it. You can go left and right, but then also up and down. By default, this is what it's going to look like, but we can also, again, go into UI settings and then change the theme color scheme. So within here, we have all the capsule ones. This is going to basically look like what we see now, but we can do the controller ones. I really like these, and we've got all these other different options. So let's do this one, Pocket Dark Controller. So we're going to select this one. And so this is what it's going to look like now, where we can see, you know, the controller of the system itself as opposed to those cartoon characters. I really like how just kind of streamlined this all looks, and I like the little rainbow stripe that we have on the right side too. So again, you can kind of pick it however you would like, and everything looks a little bit different depending on the theme. Let's stick with the canvas theme for now, and let's talk about scraping box art. You can see that I've got all this really cool stuff, but I already did this previously. Let me show you how to set it up yourself. So press the start button, go into the scraper section, and then keep this at scrape from screen scraper, scrape all the games. You can choose whichever systems you want, but we're going to do account settings first. So what you need to do is go to screenscraper.fr, then make your own username and password. It's going to be free to set up. You can also pay them like via their Patreon to get a little bit faster scraping. It's all up to you. Either way, it is a free service, so just add your username and password once you have that, and then you can then choose which systems you want to scrape. So say, for example, you want to scrape Nintendo DS only, so you can select that one, or you could go all the way down to the bottom and do select all if you'd like. Under the content settings, it's going to scrape basically everything, but I personally don't like like to scrape the game manuals because these are pretty big file sizes and it slows down the whole process. These are actually pretty cool if you want to see the game manual, so it's really going to be up to you. Under the mix image settings, it's going to compile them all together to make this really fancy look. This is actually what I have going on right now. You can see I've got the box art as well as the screenshot, and then also, of course, the game cartridge itself and the logo at the top right. So this is a mix image right there. So if you like that look, then that's where you would go into that setting. You would go into the mix image settings, and by default, this is actually what it's going to look like, what you just previously saw. They do have this one new option where you can change it from a PNG to a WebP. That's going to be a smaller file size, and so that might save you a little bit of space on your SD card. For the most part, I don't change any of that stuff, but under other settings, there is the option right here to change your region. I think by default, it'll be Europe. So if you want to have USA box art, then make sure you change it there, and so on. Other than that, I don't make any other changes. So then you just go and hit start, and then it's going to scrape through all of these games. And bear in mind, this is going to take quite some time depending on your internet speed and how fast screenscraper.fr is working, which sometimes can go down on its own. So this is something that you may want to have run overnight, for example. Either way, once it's done, you should be able to go into your systems and then navigate through and see all that fancy box art. And again, it'll all depend on what you want to actually see. If we go back to the art book next one, and then we navigate through, you can see it's only showing the box art, and then it'll show the video if we just leave it to hover for a moment. But that's essentially how it works. But maybe you don't want to see the box art, you want to see that mix image. So you can set that up on a theme basis as well. So we're going to go in there, and then under theme variant, we want to make sure it says metadata and mix image instead of box art. So now when we select that, it'll show the mix image. And so it's really going to be up to what you want to actually see. Once you got it set up, you can press the X button in the main menu to start a screensaver. So it's going to randomly go through all of the games that you've scraped and then show them. And if you want, you can actually press the A button to start up the game right then and there too. So I find this to be a really neat way to be able to navigate through and just kind of choose which game I want to play next. Like I'm looking at Ridge Racer, I'm like, that looks pretty good. I'm going to press the A button and it'll launch the game right then and there. So it kind of feels like shopping for your games, which is pretty cool. And of course, you can just exit the game and come back to the menu. There's a bunch of other things we can do in this app, but I've got dedicated videos talking about that stuff. Instead, what I really want to talk about is the ability to do the game importer. This allows you to essentially add in whatever app you would like to your main menu. Let's go into the game importer itself to talk about what I mean. So for example, Android apps. If we want to see our Android apps on here as well, and then make this like our home system, like our main launcher, then we can totally do that. So let's do Android apps first. So for this, we're going to leave it in Android apps, and then under remove entries, I like to do all unselected. That means the next time that we refresh this, it's going to remove all the ones that we don't have selected in case we want to remove anything. Under media target type, it depends on what you're using with your particular theme. Right now we're using mix images, so I'm going to use that. Import media means it's going to try to grab the thumbnail from the actual app itself. I always keep that one on. And then overwrite media files, I turn that one on as well. And then we're going to go to start. It's going to give you a warning, be like, hey, you're going to remove apps if you don't select them. We're going to hit yes. And then it's going to give you a list of all of your apps right here. Now we're just pulling in the Android apps. There's a separate section for emulators and games. And so I'm just going to pull in utilities that I would want to access within Emulation Station. So like the calendar is an option that we have here. I'm never going to need that calendar, but I may need the Chrome app. So I'm going to select that one. Same thing with Google Drive. That's always really important. Same thing with Google Files. And then also the Google Play Store. I like to have that one here as well. And then the settings app. That's usually the majority of what I will do. And then I select import. Once that's done, on the top, it says imported 5 entries. And so now if we go back, it's going to refresh Emulation Station. And now we have an Android app section. And look at that. We now have the ability to launch all of these apps right here and there. Let's try another one so you get an idea of how this all will work. So let's go back into utilities and then game importer. This time we are going to import the emulators. You can do other things like Android games, but we haven't really installed any of those yet. So let's just do the emulators right now. Everything else we're just going to leave as the same and hit start. It's going to give it that warning again, and then we're just going to go back and it's going to show all those games again. But this time we want to pick all of our emulator apps. So now I'm going to pick things like Azahar and Cemu and Dolphin and DuckStation, Eden, and so on. Once you're happy with all those, we can hit import, and it's going to take a minute, import 9 entries, and then we can back out again. It's going to restart the app. And now we've got a section called emulators, and look at that. We can jump into our individual emulators if we want. As you can imagine, you can do the same thing with your Android games. You can access them here as well. So at this point, you basically can do everything you need to within Emulation Station. If you need to jump into an app, you can do that right here. If you want to jump into an emulator, you can do that. And then of course you can navigate through all of your games. games. And so at this point, let's make Emulation Station our default launcher. So when we start up the system, it's going to go right into this. You can always undo this later if you would like to. So we're going to go into Android apps and actually go into the settings directly from Emulation Station. This is just going to take us into our Android settings, and now go into the app section right here, and then scroll down until you get to the default app section. Once you click on that, there's the home app, and by default, it's going to be Quick Step. We're going to make it ESDE. And so now by default, when you start up your device, it's just going to start up just like this. You'll be able to go into anything you want. And if you press the start button, there's no option now to quit Emulation Station because obviously it's the main launcher. So it's always going to go back to this. Now, if you want to go back and change that back, you just go into Android settings, go into settings again, and then under apps and default apps and home app, just change this back to the quick step one instead. So there you go. We are now fully set up with our Retroid Pocket 6. We can navigate through all of our different systems and then open that up and then launch our games from here. It's a really cool and intuitive system. And obviously you can use other front-end launchers if you would like, but Emulation Station for me wraps it together all very nicely. If you've got any questions about this setup, then I would recommend checking out the written guide that I'll have linked down below that will allow you to go through at your own pace. At the end of the day, it's really cool that you went through this whole setup with me. I know this was a very long video. I'm trying to keep it under 2 hours, but who knows how this is going to go. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.